Every culture on Earth, separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of years with no contact whatsoever, tells some version of the same story. There were worlds before this one, worlds that ended, worlds that were destroyed by flood, by fire, by darkness, by the anger of gods, or simply by time running out. And in an almost eerie number of these traditions, the count lands on the same number. 7. 7 suns, 7 ages, 7 root races, 7 worlds, with ours being the last one standing, or maybe just the latest one standing. So here's the question that's going to drive everything in this video. What if that number isn't a coincidence? What if buried underneath the myths, the religious texts, and yes, even some of the wilder pseudo-archaeology claims floating around the internet, there's a kernel of something real? Not aliens, not lost super-civilizations with laser technology. Something stranger, and honestly more interesting, actual planetary resets. Real climate catastrophes, real bottlenecks that nearly wiped humanity off the map more than once. 6 worlds before ours. What could that phrase actually be pointing to? Now, before we go any further, I want to set some ground rules, because this is where most videos on this topic go completely off the rails. There's a difference between evidence, interpretation, and speculation, and we're going to be honest about which is which the entire way through. Evidence is what we can measure: ice cores, sediment layers, genetic markers, radiocarbon dates. Interpretation is what scientists argue about when the evidence is incomplete, which, this deep in time, it almost always is. And speculation, that's the fun part. The part where we ask what if, but we're not going to pretend speculation is proof. Deep time is messy. The further back you go, the fewer fossils survive, the fewer records exist, and the harder it becomes to separate what actually happened from what people needed to believe happened. To make sense of all this, we're going to look through 3 different lenses throughout this video. First, the mythic lens, the ancient stories themselves, from Hindu Yugas to Greek ages of man to Mesoamerican Suns. Second, the archaeological lens, the physical sites and artifacts that keep forcing historians to push timelines earlier than anyone expected. And third, the earth science lens, the actual planetary catastrophes, the ice ages, the floods, the climate shocks that we know for a fact reshaped human history more than once. Before we dive in, I want to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment telling me your city and what time it is right now for you. I read these, and it's honestly wild: Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, Cape Town on a lunch break, all listening to the same story about worlds that ended long before any of our cities existed. It's a strange kind of connection across a very disconnected planet. And if you want this without any ads or music interrupting the story, we're on Spotify now, completely free. The link's in the description. Following there also genuinely helps this channel keep making these deep dives, and if you've got 30 seconds, a 5-star review goes a long way too. It's the easiest way to support this without spending a dime. Alright, 6 worlds. One number that keeps showing up everywhere. Let's find out what it might actually mean. Okay, so before we go chasing 7 worlds across 4 continents and about 1 million years of human history, we need to stop and ask a question that sounds almost too simple. What actually counts as a civilization? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If you ask 10 different historians, you're going to get 10 different answers, and none of them are wrong. They're just measuring different things. Some researchers define civilization narrowly. Cities, writing systems, centralized government, social stratification, monumental architecture. Under this definition, civilization is a fairly recent invention. We're talking maybe 6,000 years old, starting with places like Sumer and Egypt. Anything before that, no matter how sophisticated, doesn't count. Hunter-gatherers don't count. Early farming villages don't count. Even something as impressive as Göbekli Tepe, which we're going to spend a lot of time on later in this video, technically doesn't count under this definition, because it doesn't check every single box on the checklist. But other researchers use a much broader definition. To them, civilization is really just organized culture. Shared beliefs, cooperative behavior, technology passed down across generations, symbolic thinking. Under this broader definition, civilization could stretch back tens of thousands of years, maybe further. Cave art counts, complex burial rituals count, long-distance trade networks count. Suddenly the timeline explodes, and what looked like a recent invention starts looking like something much older, something that's been building in fits and starts for a very, very long time. And then there's a third way of looking at it that a lot of people forget entirely. Civilization as species-wide technological capability. Not what one group in one place was doing, but what humanity as a whole was capable of at any given moment. Under this lens, you're not asking, did the Egyptians build pyramids? You're asking, could humans anywhere on Earth have built something like this if they'd needed to? This is actually the definition that matters most when we start talking about lost worlds and forgotten ages, because myths rarely talk about specific empires. They talk about entire ages of humanity rising and falling together. So right there, before we've even gotten to the myths themselves, we've got three completely different rulers to measure civilization with: a narrow one based on cities and writing, a broad one based on shared culture, and a species-wide one based on collective capability. Keep those three in your back pocket, because we're going to need all of them later. Now, here's where it gets even trickier. What do we even mean when we say world? Because that word is doing a lot of heavy lifting in ancient traditions, and it doesn't always mean the same thing twice. Sometimes world means an era, a stretch of time with its own rules, its own dominant powers, its own eventual ending. This is how the Hindu concept of Yugas works, and it's how the Greek ages of man work too. A world in this sense isn't a place, it's a chapter. Sometimes world means something much more literal. An actual physical realm, a continent, a landmass that existed and then didn't. This is closer to how people tend to imagine Atlantis or Lemuria, whether or not those places were ever real in the way the stories describe them. Sometimes world refers to a climate regime, a version of the planet defined by temperature, sea level, rainfall patterns. An Ice Age world looks nothing like an interglacial world. Coastlines are in different places. Deserts are where forests used to be. In a very real sense, the Earth during the last glacial maximum was a different world from the one we're living in now, even though it was the same planet, the same continents, the same species walking around on it. And sometimes world means something symbolic, a spiritual or moral state of humanity. A golden age of innocence, followed by a fall into corruption. This is less about geography or climate, and more about how a culture understands human nature itself, how far we've drifted from some imagined original purity. So, when a myth says there were 6 worlds before ours, which of these are we even talking about? An era? A place? A climate? A moral condition? Honestly, in a lot of traditions it's some blend of all 4, layered on top of each other until the original meaning gets a little blurry. This is exactly why counting civilizations or counting worlds is such a subjective exercise. There's no universally agreed upon scoreboard, no committee somewhere stamping official approval on which societies count as civilizations and which ones don't. Every time someone tells you we are the 7th civilization, or there were 6 worlds before ours, they are making an implicit choice about what counts, and that choice shapes the entire story that follows. And this brings us to something really important about myths specifically, something we need to understand before we start walking through them one by one. Myths are not history books. They were never meant to be. They compress enormous stretches of time into short, memorable narratives, because that's what allows them to survive being passed down orally for generations, sometimes for thousands of years, without being written down at all. Think about what that actually requires. If a real event, say a catastrophic flood, or a period of prolonged climate stress, happened over the course of several centuries, that story has to get compressed into something a storyteller can tell around a fire in 20 minutes. Details get simplified, timelines get collapsed. Multiple similar events happening in different places at different times might get merged into a single dramatic story about one flood, one collapse, one fall from grace. On top of that, myths almost always carry a moral message. They're not just recording what happened, they're teaching people how to behave. A story about a world destroyed because humanity became greedy or violent or disrespectful to the gods isn't just describing a catastrophe. It's warning the listener, don't be like them, or this will happen to you too. That moral layer gets woven so tightly into the narrative that it becomes almost impossible to separate the memory of a real event from the lesson the storytellers wanted to teach with it. This doesn't mean myths are useless as historical evidence. Far from it. It means we have to read them carefully, treating them the way a geologist treats sediment layers, understanding that what we're looking at has been compressed, distorted, and reshaped by forces we can only partially reconstruct. Sometimes there's a real climate event buried under the moral lesson. Sometimes there's a genuine memory of a lost coastline buried under the flood story. And sometimes, honestly, there's nothing underneath at all except a good story that happened to spread. So here's the framework we're going to carry through the rest of this video. For every world, every civilization, every lost age we look at, we're going to ask 3 questions. What definition of civilization or world does this claim actually rely on? What is the evidence, the actual measurable stuff, versus the interpretation built on top of it? And what parts of the story look like they might be moral lesson dressed up as memory, versus something that lines up with real, testable, planetary history? Because once you start asking those questions, something interesting happens. The number 7 stops looking like magic and starts looking a lot more like a pattern worth actually investigating. To do that, we need to put our feet on bedrock for a minute. Not legends, not channeled teachings, not YouTube thumbnails with glowing pyramids. Just the part of the story we can actually test. On the timescale we're talking about in this video, the baseline looks something like this. Our species, Homo sapiens, shows up in Africa a bit more than 300,000 years ago, in a form we'd recognize as us, not necessarily identical in behavior, but anatomically modern. For most of that time, we're talking small, mobile, hunter-gatherer bands, not cities and skyscrapers. By around 100,000 years ago, there are people in the Levant, maybe pushing in and out of the Middle East as climates shift. By about 60,000 years ago, a major dispersal out of Africa kicks off. Groups spread along the coasts of Arabia, down through India, into Southeast Asia, and eventually to Australia by at least 50,000 years ago. Europe fills in more slowly, with modern humans really taking over Neanderthal territories around 45,000 years ago. The Americas are reached much later, at least by 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier along some now submerged coastal routes. For the vast majority of that timeline, there is zero evidence of anything like industrial civilization. No steel, no concrete megacities, no power grids, no global shipping. What we see instead is stone tools, fire, pigments, beads, bone points, and later bows, woven textiles, pottery, and eventually farming. That doesn't mean ancient people were simple. It means their toolkit was adapted to a world where small, flexible groups beat giant centralized empires almost every time. So immediately there's a tension. Myths talk about world after world rising and falling, But the part of the record we can actually see looks a lot more like a long, slow climb with some nasty bumps, not 6 complete technological reboots. But here's the catch. The archaeological record is not a fair judge. It plays favourites. Things that preserve well are things that are hard, or that happen to get buried quickly in the right conditions. Stone tools survive. Burned bones survive. Pottery survives decently if it's not ground to dust by later activity. Big piles of shell, middens, last a long time. In really lucky circumstances, you get wooden structures in waterlogged mud, frozen carcasses in permafrost, or footprints in volcanic ash. Things that do not preserve well? Pretty much everything we associate with a modern technological civilization. Wood rots, textiles disintegrate, leather vanishes, iron rusts back into the ground, electronics, plastics, rubber, all the stuff that feels permanent to us now, gets destroyed shockingly fast on geological timescales. Give the average modern city 20,000 years of weather, plant roots, earthquakes and glacial cycles, and most of what's left will be oddly shaped mineral deposits and some disturbed sediment. Now add ice ages to that picture. Over the last couple million years, Earth has cycled in and out of glacial and interglacial phases like clockwork. Every 100,000 years or so, ice sheets grow, sea levels fall by up to 120 meters, coastlines march outward, and huge new areas of land emerge. Then the climate warms, the ice melts, and the ocean takes all that land back. If you wanted to design a planetary document shredder for coastal archaeology, this would be it. Right now, a gigantic fraction of the places humans would have loved to live during the Ice Age are underwater. The richest fishing grounds, the mildest coastal climates, the big river mouths where people could have camped and eventually farmed, gone, buried under continental shelves. Any ports, villages, or small coastal civilizations that might have existed 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 years ago on those exposed plains are now under tens of meters of seawater and a thick layer of sediment. So when someone says, we don't see evidence of an advanced Ice Age civilization on land, therefore it didn't exist, they're skipping a step. A huge slice of the potential real estate has literally been erased or is currently inaccessible. But that doesn't mean anything goes. We're not completely blind. We have a toolkit for peeking into deep time, and each tool comes with strengths and hard limits. Radiocarbon dating is the famous one. It measures how much radioactive carbon is left in once living things, charcoal, bones, seeds, and counts back the years. It's incredibly powerful for the last 40,000–50,000 years. Before that, the signal is too faint and the numbers get too fuzzy. So radiocarbon is amazing for the period from the last ice age to now, but useless if you're trying to date something that's supposedly 200,000 or 500,000 years old. Stratigraphy is simpler but broader, layering. Older stuff is generally deeper, younger stuff is higher up, unless earthquakes, rivers, or humans rearrange things. It doesn't give you an exact year, but it gives you order. This came before that. It lets us see long sequences of occupation, change, abandonment, and sometimes sudden disaster. Then there's genetics. Instead of digging in dirt, you're digging in DNA. How populations are related, when they likely split, how big they were at different times. Genetic clocks are noisy and rely on assumptions, but they're good at telling us things like, there probably wasn't a giant global human population 200,000 years ago, or there was a bottleneck here, or these groups have been separated for roughly this long. If you want to hide an entire industrial civilization in deep time, you have to fit it inside those population curves. On top of that, we have other dating methods for rocks and sediments, things like luminescence dating, uranium series, argon-argon. We won't dive into the technicalities here, but the point is, multiple independent clocks are all ticking away, and when they line up, we can be reasonably confident about broad timelines. This is where the balance comes in. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when whole coastal plains are gone and organic materials vanish quickly. Gaps in the record are expected. It would actually be weird if there weren't mysteries and missing chapters. But absence of evidence isn't proof of absence, is not a magic license to assert anything you want. An industrial-level civilization, even one that hugged coastlines, would leave indirect fingerprints, weird global chemical signatures, massive mining scars, bizarre spikes in sediment layers, city-sized anomalies, odd isotopes in ice cores. The deeper we look, the more of those we can test for. So, as we walk into the mythic worlds next, Hindu Yugas, Greek ages, Mesoamerican Suns, we're going to keep one foot in that tested timeline. We'll ask, could this story map onto something we actually see in the ice, in the mud, in the genes? And at the same time, where are we staring into blank spaces and maybe seeing whatever we most want to find? Because the real mystery isn't just what the myths remember. It's how much of our own past the planet itself has already wiped clean. In Hindu cosmology, time doesn't move in a straight line. It turns. The core idea is the Yuga cycle. Instead of one golden age, one fall, and one final judgment, you get 4 repeating ages stacked like a cosmic staircase running downhill. At the top is Satya Yuga, sometimes called Krita Yuga. This is the age of truth, the full-strength version of humanity. Dharma, cosmic order, moral rightness is said to stand on 4 legs like a perfectly balanced table. People live long lives, are deeply spiritual, and don't need complex laws or institutions to keep them in line. In some texts, they don't even need agriculture. The earth itself is generous. You just live in tune with it. Then comes Treta Yuga. Still good, but a step down. Dharma loses a leg. People are a bit less virtuous, a bit more self-interested. You start seeing kings, wars, and big heroic epics set in this time Rama, the Ramayana, that whole world. Technology and ritual become more elaborate. You need systems and structures to compensate for the fact that people aren't naturally perfect anymore. Next is Dvapara Yuga. Dharma is down to 2 legs. This is the age of tension. The Mahabharata war, Krishna, elaborate politics, massive weapons in mythic battles. Humans are clever, powerful, and increasingly dangerous. Knowledge spreads, but so does corruption. Finally, you hit Kali Yuga. That's the age we're supposedly in now. Dharma balances on 1 leg, about to topple. The texts describe it as a time of moral decay, short lifespans, hypocrisy, greed, and the erosion of tradition. Sound familiar to a lot of people scrolling social media at 2 a.m. Now, if you take all of this literally the way some modern interpreters do, you get a staggering timescale. In one common version, a full cycle of 4 yugas runs for 4.32 million years. We're said to be a few thousand years into the last and worst phase, with many thousands more to go before the cycle resets. But there's another way to read this, and it matters for our 7 civilizations question. You can think of the yugas less as literal calendar dates and more as moral and technological metaphors. Satya Yuga is maximum alignment, a story about how humans imagine an ideal society, little crime, high trust, low complexity. Treta and Dvapara are sliding scales of compromise. More hierarchy, more conflict, more tools to manage both. Kali Yuga is what it feels like when social trust is low, inequality is high, institutions are shaky, and people start saying, things aren't like they used to be. In that light, previous worlds in Hindu thought don't have to mean separate planets with different species of humans rebooting from scratch. They can be earlier phases of humanity on this planet, remembered as better or worse depending on how people in a later age feel about their own world. Imagine living in a time of invasion, famine, or political collapse. Your grandparents tell you about when the rivers ran clean, harvests were stable, and rulers cared about justice. It's very easy to turn that into, we used to be in a higher yuga. Now everything is decaying. This is where the advanced past motifs creep in. In some readings of the Mahabharata, weapons like the Brahmastra are described in language that sounds eerily like nukes or missiles. Blinding flashes, intense heat, fallout, like sickness. Cities are said to be destroyed in moments. You'll see memes about ancient Sanskrit texts describing nuclear war all over the internet. The mainstream scholarly view is more cautious. These are epic poems packed with exaggeration, metaphor, and the high drama language you expect from cultures that loved big operatic storytelling. The nuclear descriptions line up pretty well with lightning, firestorms, and imagination, not radiation sickness curves. But the pattern is interesting. People project modern tech back into myth, and myth conveniently provides a template for we once had terrible, powerful tools and lost them. There are also stories of flying machines, vimanas in some late Sanskrit, and vernacular texts and commentaries. In certain circles they've been reinterpreted as literal aircraft or even spaceships. Historically, a lot of that material is very late, medieval or modern, and influenced by already existing fascination with machines. But again, the theme fits the Yuga logic. Earlier ages had access to marvellous things. The current age is a degraded echo. Then there's the timescale problem. If you take the full Yuga timings at face value, you're dealing with millions of years of human-like existence on Earth. That clashes hard with everything we walked through in the last section. The fossil record, genetics, radiometric dating. We simply don't see anatomically modern humans, agriculture, cities, or anything like that, stretching back millions of years. We don't even see primate-level intelligence rebooting in multiple independent civilizations. The Earth keeps very rough track of that kind of thing. So most historians and Indologists treat Yuga durations as symbolic numbers, huge, awe-inducing figures meant to express cosmic vastness, not please plug this into your spreadsheet. Ancient cultures loved big, round, repeating numbers. They used them the way we use a billion years or since forever in casual speech. But even if the exact dates and technologies are poetic, the structure of the story has teeth. You get a repeating pattern: rise, flourish, overreach, decay, reset. Human virtue and human capacity don't just ramp up forever. They peak and crumble. Knowledge isn't guaranteed to accumulate. It can be fragmented, hoarded, or forgotten. The world you inhabit can feel like a thin remnant of something greater that came before. That cyclical worldview is one of the deep roots of modern lost civilization narratives. If you already see history as a series of declining ages, it's almost natural to ask, what did people used to know that we've lost? How high did we climb last time? You don't need spaceships in the Bronze Age for that question to make sense. You just need the intuition that progress is not a straight line, and that the ruins around you might be the late broken pieces of a more complete pattern. Others take it a step further. They graft the Yuga cycle directly onto geological and archaeological timelines. Satya Yuga becomes some idealized Ice Age civilization. Treta Yuga lines up with the last glacial maximum. Dwapara Yuga is the slow thaw and sea level rise. Kali Yuga is the post-flood world we're in now, supposedly limping along on the scraps of forgotten science. It's a compelling story map. The problem is, once you check it against the hard clocks, ice cores, sediments, genetics, the precise matches start to fall apart. Still, the Yugas leave us with an important lens. They say, don't assume you're the peak. Don't assume decline is impossible, and don't assume that if there were earlier worlds of humans, they would look exactly like ours or leave the same kinds of traces. Next, we'll turn to a different mythic tradition that runs in parallel, the Greek and Roman ages of man. Another staircase of metals and morals, another story about how the world used to be better, and how many times it's already fallen apart. When you shift from India to the ancient Mediterranean, you find a strangely familiar shape. The Greek poet Hesiod, writing around 700 BCE, lays out his own version of human history in the Works and Days, the ages of man. And just like the Yugas, it's basically a staircase going down. First comes the Golden Age. Under the rule of Cronus, humans live like gods. No toil, no grief, no old age as we know it. The earth gives food freely. People don't have to farm, fight, or hustle. They just live long, peaceful lives and then gently fade. Then Zeus takes over and we slip to the Silver Age. Humans are still big and long-lived, but they're childish and arrogant. They don't honour the gods. They make bad choices. Zeus gets fed up and wipes them out. Next is the Bronze Age, not the archaeologist Bronze Age, but a mythic one. These people are hard, violent, obsessed with war. Their homes, their tools, even their very selves are described as bronze. They live by the sword and die by it, disappearing into Hades with no legacy. Then you get a weird, short insert, the Age of Heroes. Hesiod treats it like a partial reset. After the brutal bronze folk, there appears a nobler race, the heroes of Thebes and Troy, the people of the epics. They're still warriors, still dying in battle, but they're closer to the gods, and after death some of them are said to dwell in the Isles of the Blessed. Finally, there's the Iron Age. Hesiod says this is his own time, and he hates it. It's an age of toil, injustice, broken oaths, corrupt judges. Children don't honour parents, strength makes right. He predicts it will get even worse until shame and justice themselves abandon humanity. Swap out the Sanskrit dharma for Greek decay and a moralised concept of justice, and you've got the same basic feeling. We started in a simpler, better world, and we've been grinding downhill ever since. Only with Hesiod, it's more bitter, more personal. He's explicitly talking about land disputes, unfair courts, and the grim reality of farming in a harsh landscape. And again, people later start treating this moral staircase like a timeline of forgotten civilizations. By the Roman period, writers like Ovid remix the scheme. In the Metamorphoses, he gives a polished version, golden, silver, bronze, iron, with no separate heroic age. Golden is harmony and abundance. Silver sees seasons introduced, so you suddenly need agriculture and shelter. Bronze is tougher, quicker to war, but not yet wicked. Iron is full corruption, sailing, mining cities, law courts. In other words, civilization itself becomes a symptom of decline. Wrapped into these stories are the same motifs you see worldwide, worlds ended by flood and fire. Ovid's Iron Age gets so bad that Zeus, Jupiter in Roman terms, decides to reset the board. Not with a gentle reform, but with a planetary flood. He drowns nearly everyone, sparing only Deucalion and Pyrrha, a pious couple who survive in a chest or boat and then repopulate the world by throwing stones over their shoulders that turn into people. Elsewhere in Greek mythology, you get talk of previous destructions by fire. There's the Phaethon story. A reckless sun tries to drive the sun's chariot, loses control, scorches the earth, and Zeus has to blast him with a thunderbolt to stop a full cosmic meltdown. It reads like an ancient attempt to imagine what happens if the sky itself goes wrong, if heat becomes lethal. If you strip away the gods and poetic drama, what kinds of real events could sit underneath this? Ancient Greece and Italy sit on some of the most geologically active ground on Earth. Massive earthquakes, sudden tsunamis, volcanic eruptions that black out the sky. These aren't rare on human timescales. Within historical memory alone, Thera, Santorini, exploded in the Late Bronze Age. Vesuvius buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. Whole coasts have risen and sunk. A culture living through even one of those would have stories. A culture living through many over centuries would have patterns. A huge tsunami doesn't just flood a town. From the shoreline, it looks like the sea itself rises up and eats the land. An eruption that darkens the sun and kills crops for a couple of years feels like the sky is on fire and the gods are punishing you. Volcanic ash in the atmosphere can create short, sharp, volcanic winters where temperatures drop and harvests fail. Layer onto that periods of regional drought or the kind of famine that forces people to abandon villages and migrate, and you have all the emotional ingredients for the world ended. But the way humans remember that isn't with footnotes and graphs. It's with myth. Oral tradition is surprisingly good at preserving certain things. It can keep the memory of once long ago the sea came far inland alive for thousands of years. It can remember that when the mountain smoked, the sun went dim and the animals died. It notices the pattern that social order collapses when famine hits, that migrations follow bad harvests, that cities fall after earthquakes. What it's terrible at is dates, scales, and precise causation. Hesiod doesn't tell you in 1200 BCE there was a systemic Bronze Age collapse driven by trade disruption, climate shifts, and raiders from the sea. He gives you a Bronze Age of violent men, swallowed by time. Greek and Roman authors don't log volcanic sulfate spikes. They talk about years without summer and omens in the sky. Their flood is global, even if the real destruction was regional. That's the trade-off. Myth compresses multiple crises into one story, merges local disasters with moral lessons, and gives you a narrative you can tell by the fire. It preserves the pattern plenty to scarcity, order to chaos, world to ruin, but it blurs the specifics. So when later thinkers talk about previous ages or lost worlds, counting off golden, silver, bronze, heroic, iron-like distinct civilizations, it might not be about separate species or Atlantis-style supertech. It may be about cycles of stability and breakdown that agrarian societies actually lived through. A long stretch of decent harvests and peace feels golden in retrospect. A century of wars, earthquakes, and failed crops feels like iron. Tossed in a catastrophic event every few generations, a big quake, a regional flood, a volcanic haze that ruins 2 summers, and you get punctuation marks sharp enough to be remembered as the time the gods nearly wiped us out. From that angle, the Greek-Roman ages of man don't have to be a literal list of 5 or 6 completed civilizations. They might be a psychological seismograph of how fragile civilization feels when you're farming thin soil in a tectonic minefield. Every rise looks temporary. Every fall looks like the end of the world. And just like with the Yugas, that cyclical anxiety becomes the backdrop for modern questions. If they thought they were in the Iron Age, standing on the ruins of better worlds, how many times has this pattern actually played out? How many ages have there really been? To chase that, we'll cross the ocean to another culture with its own layered worlds and apocalyptic resets. The Mesoamerican Suns, where creation and destruction come around again and again. When the Spanish marched into the Valley of Mexico in the early 1500s, they walked into a civilization that already thought it was living in someone else's leftovers. The Aztec priestly historians didn't say, "This is the first world." They said, "We are in the 5th sun." In their worldview, history runs in cycles called suns. Each sun is a whole era, a world with its own sky, its own people, and its own way of ending badly. In the most common Nahua version, the first sun is Nahui Ocelotl, 4 Jaguar. The people of that age are giants, and they get eaten. The gods send jaguars that tear them apart and end the world. The second sun is Nahui Ehekatl, 4 Wind. This time the disaster is hurricanes, divine winds so violent they strip the earth. Humans are blown away, transformed into monkeys. The third sun, Nahui Quahuitl, 4 Rain, goes out not with water, but with fire from the sky. A rain of burning stones, often glossed as volcanoes or meteors, scours the world. Survivors turn into birds. The fourth sun is Nahui Atl, 4 Water. Now you get the flood. The heavens open, the seas rise, the whole world drowns. The people of that age become fish. And then there's the fifth sun, Nahui Olin, 4 Movement, the one the Aztecs believed they were living in. They didn't think it would last forever. The prophecy said this sun would end through movement, earthquakes, global shaking, maybe a series of convulsions that tear the earth apart. So if you're keeping score, that's 4 previous worlds, each reset by a different catastrophe. Jaguars, hurricane winds, fire from the sky, a global flood. Now we're in number 5, balanced on a knife edge of seismic doom. Taken literally, it sounds like science fantasy. Entire universes destroyed and replaced. People turning into animals as a kind of cosmic consolation prize. But remember the lens we used with the Yugas and the ages of man. You don't have to read this as the entire cosmos blinked out and a new one loaded in. You can read sun as era, as epoch. Each sun becomes a way to talk about a phase of the world, a long, coherent stretch of time with its own climate, its own way of life, and its own signature disaster at the end. When you set that against what we know about the prehistoric Americas, the pattern gets interesting. This is a continent that goes through the late Pleistocene extinctions, the loss of mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. For people living through that, the world really would have felt different before and after. A landscape full of enormous, dangerous animals is not the same world as one where they're gone. A culture that hunts megafauna is not the same as one that has to turn to smaller game and plants. Fast forward to the Holocene, and you get big climate swings. Multi-decade droughts in Mesoamerica, swings in rainfall patterns driven by things like El Niño, shifts in where crops can reliably grow. Archaeology in the region keeps turning up evidence of cities strained or abandoned because the rains changed. Teotihuacan, centuries before the Aztecs, seems to go through internal unrest and fire destruction in a period of environmental stress. The classic Maya lowlands experience what looks like a slow-motion demographic collapse between roughly 750 and 900 CE, with drought as one major suspect. Later polities along the Gulf Coast and highlands rise and fall, often in lockstep with climate proxies that show dry spells, floods, or volcanic disturbance. From the ground, none of that looks like small perturbations in regional precipitation regimes. It looks like the gods took away the rain. The maize failed. Our neighbours starved or migrated. The old cities died. The world changed, now add volcanoes. Central America and southern Mexico ride the same tectonic mess as the Mediterranean. There are eruptions that blanket fields in ash, darken the sky, ruin several harvests in a row. There are earthquakes that knock down temples, crack aqueducts, change the course of rivers. Lightning, hailstorms, hail that shreds crops in an hour. These are normal enough that deities of weather and storm sit at the centre of the pantheon. A myth system that says each age ends with a different kind of disaster starts to feel less like fantasy and more like a compressed climate archive. Fire, flood, wind, beasts shaking earth, Mesoamerica provides all of them. But there are two big complications before we map Aztec mythology straight onto deep time. First, a lot of what we know about the five suns comes from sources written down after the Spanish conquest, in a situation full of political spin and cultural trauma. Nahua elites are suddenly explaining themselves to Christian monks, negotiating status and trying to preserve fragments of their worldview under hostile scrutiny. That's a recipe for remixing, editing and retrofitting old stories. Second, the Aztecs themselves were empire builders with PR departments. They had every incentive to present their own era as cosmically special and precarious. In their version, the continued existence of the fifth sun depends on them, on their rituals, their sacrifices, their wars. If they fail, the sun literally stops. That's imperial theology. Your state isn't just a government. It's the engine keeping the cosmos running. So when we read Aztec accounts of previous suns, we're getting late-stage, state-level myth-making layered over older Mesoamerican traditions, Toltec, Teotihuacano, Maya and others, many of which have their own cycles of creation and destruction, often with different details. Even so, the pattern that survives into these late sources is revealing. It trains you to think in catastrophe first terms. The normal state of the world is not stable, it's precarious. Every age ends violently, with an element of nature going rogue. The question isn't, will this world end? But how and when? And will we see it coming? If you grow up in that narrative, you're primed to interpret major change through the lens of resets. A drought isn't just bad weather. It could be the beginning of the end of the sun. An earthquake that topples temples isn't just tectonics. It's the earth flexing toward its final convulsion. That mindset sounds eerily similar to modern, we're the late civilization thinking. It makes it easy centuries later for people to look at the five suns and say, see? We're not the first. There have been 4 worlds before this, but to see whether anything like that is actually true, we have to look beyond one region's myths and ask a bigger question. Are these end-of-the-world stories all just local metaphors for local collapses, or do they echo any real, global-scale resets? To test that, we'll widen the lens again from Mesoamerica to the entire planet, and look at the most widespread motif of all, the Great Flood. If you start pulling on the flood thread, it doesn't stop. Mesopotamia has Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, warned by a god building a boat riding out a world-drowning deluge. The Hebrew Bible reshapes that into Noah. In India, Manu is tipped off by a talking fish, saves the seeds of life, and rides out Pralaya, a flood that ends a cosmic cycle. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive Zeus's flood and repopulate the land. In China, there's not just one. Gun and Yu fight ages-long floods that cover the plains. In the Pacific, Polynesian traditions are full of canoes, storms, and lands that sink beneath the sea. In the Americas, from the Maya and Inca to many North American nations, you get stories of waters rising, mountains becoming islands, people turning into birds or fish or clinging to trees as everything drowns. If you map them, flood myths cluster exactly where you'd expect, around big river systems, fertile deltas, and coastlines. Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, which can go from life-giving to apocalyptic in a few days. The Nile with its rhythmic floods and occasional disasters. The Indus and Ganges Brahmaputra. The Yellow River, literally nicknamed China's Sorrow for its lethal shifts. The Mississippi, the Amazon. River cultures live by floods. They also die by them. So what does that global spread actually tell us? First, it tells us that people everywhere have had front row seats to water doing terrifying things. You don't need a planet-wide ocean reset to generate a culture-defining story. You just need a flood big enough to erase your known world, your valley, your city, your strip of coast. Second, it doesn't by itself prove there was one single global event that all these stories remember. Humans are really good at independently inventing similar explanations for similar experiences. Every culture has fire. Many have fire theft myths. Every culture has death. Many have underworld journeys. Water that comes from the sky covers the land and wipes out the neighbours is a universal nightmare. Of course it shows up everywhere, but there's a spectrum between pure metaphor and literal memory of a worldwide cataclysm, and the interesting stuff lives in the middle. On one end you've got local floods, a monsoon that stalls, a hurricane that pushes a wall of water upriver, a dam of ice or debris that suddenly fails. To the people in that catchment that can feel and be total. Everyone you know is affected, your farmland is gone, your dead are floating. When you retell that story 200 years later, our valley was ruined can easily become the world drowned. Step up a scale and you hit regional sea level rise. At the end of the last ice age, as the great ice sheets melted, global sea level climbed on the order of 120 metres. Not in a day, but in surges and pauses over millennia. That slow average hides local drama. Sometimes coastlines retreat by tens of metres a year. Barrier islands overtop and vanish. Salt water invades freshwater marshes. Estuaries widen into bays. A fishing ground your grandparents used is now 20 metres underwater. Deltas and shallow shelves are particularly vulnerable. Places like the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, the Black Sea Basin, the Persian Gulf, the North Sea's Doggerland, all were once dry or much drier, then drowned. Generation after generation would have watched their edge of the world move inland. Myths from these regions often talk about lands lost to the sea, ancient cities offshore, gods angry with coastal peoples. You don't need sonar maps to create that story. You just have to walk the same beach for 5 lifetimes and see it vanish. Then there are the genuine catastrophes, outburst floods. When an ice dam or landslide holds back a huge lake and then fails, you can get a wall of water hundreds of meters high tearing across a continent. The Missoula floods at the end of the last ice age carved the scablands of the Pacific Northwest. Similar events occurred in Eurasia when proglacial lakes broke. People living downstream would see hills stripped, forests ripped out, boulders moved like pebbles. Surviving that, if anyone did, would feel like making it through the end of the world. These mechanisms, river floods, drowning coasts, outburst megafloods, seed flood world memories. The pattern is always the same. Water invades land that was supposed to be stable. The boundary between safe and deadly shifts. The map in your grandparents' heads is wrong. Then human psychology gets to work. We don't like senseless disasters. We narrativize them. The simplest move is moralization. The flood came because people were wicked or arrogant or broke a taboo. You see this in Genesis, in Mesopotamian texts, in Greek myths, in some indigenous American tellings. The deluge becomes not just a thing that happened, but a verdict. The next move is making it an origin story. After the flood, the world is cleaned. A small group survives on a boat on a mountaintop in a cave and becomes the ancestors of everyone. That structure does a lot of work. It explains why different tribes are related. It explains scattered flood deposits and drowned ruins. It stakes a claim. Our group are the chosen survivors. Once you have that scaffold, the story can travel. Traders, migrants and missionaries carry flood narratives along the same routes as obsidian and grain. Details get swapped in. Local mountains, local gods, local villains. By the time scribes write them down, you might be looking at a hybrid, part memory of an actual flood, part moral lesson, part political propaganda. All of that, plus the sheer number of flood myths, makes them catnip for lost civilization theories. The argument goes like this: if cultures all over the world remember a great deluge that wiped out an earlier humanity, then they must all be dimly recalling the same real event, the destruction of a prior global civilization. There are problems, though. The timelines in the myths rarely line up. Some floods are put at the end of a previous age, some at the beginning of this one, some in the middle of genealogies you can roughly date. The scale is inconsistent. In some, only a valley floods, in others the entire cosmos. The mechanics vary wildly, and when we look at the geological record for the last, say, 50,000 years, we do see dramatic regional floods and sea level jumps, but not a single synchronous global ocean reset any time in the span that would leave cultural echoes. That doesn't mean there were no shared events. It means shared may look like this: multiple regions around the world experiencing their own extreme floods during the chaotic meltwater pulses at the end of the last ice age. Different peoples go through their own world ends in water moments, each perfectly real, each mythologized in parallel. Later, when these stories meet through contact or conquest, they resonate and merge. It feels like everybody remembers the same thing, but under the hood it's many overlapping disasters, not one. So flood myths give us something tantalizing but slippery. They almost certainly preserve memories of real hydrological chaos: rivers going rogue, coasts drowning, ice dam lakes exploding. They absolutely tell us how humans react by turning trauma into moral drama and genealogy. What they don't yet give us on their own is solid evidence for a drowned worldwide civilization with satellites and skyscrapers. To chase that idea seriously, we have to step out of myth entirely for a moment, and into the rocks, the cores and the crater claims, into the most dramatic real climate whiplash in recent prehistory, the Younger Dryas. If flood myths are about the world ending in water, cyclical time myths are about the world ending in paperwork. Because once you start farming, taxing, and ruling, the thing most likely to erase your world isn't an ocean, it's a breakdown in who gets to say what's legitimate. Take China instead of one big apocalypse. Classical Chinese thought gives you a loop. Dynasties rise, flourish, decay, fall, and get replaced. The underlying logic is the mandate of heaven, Tianming. Heaven grants a ruler the right to govern, but it's conditional. Good government, social harmony, reasonable taxes, respect for ritual, mandate secured, corruption, neglect, peasant uprisings. The mandate starts to wobble. Throw in famine, plague, floods, eclipses, earthquakes, sudden spikes in suffering and strangeness, and everyone agrees heaven has withdrawn its favour. At that point, rebellion isn't just allowed, it's righteous. This turns political collapse into a kind of cosmological reset. The Shang world doesn't just lose, it becomes the last age that had gone corrupt before the Zhou renewed everything. The late Ming era doesn't just have bad emperors, it becomes a textbook example of a doomed, decadent world that deserved to be swept away by the Qing. Over and over, historians and philosophers frame each fallen dynasty as the end of an age. Not the end of time, but an end of legitimacy. A civilization dies, a civilization is reborn. Same rivers, same fields, different moral universe. You can read the mandate of heaven as high-minded metaphysics. You can also read it as a very practical way of talking about state failure. Drought hits. Locusts eat the crops. The Yellow River breaks its banks and drowns your village. You don't have climate models, you have stories. So you say, the world order is broken. The emperor has lost heaven's mandate. A new one must come. World before ours here means regime before ours, a socio-political cycle, not a lost epoch of prehistory. You see a related pattern in the ancient Near East, but dressed up very differently. Sumerian and Babylonian king lists don't just say, "Here are some rulers." They begin with a bombshell. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Before the flood, they list antediluvian kings ruling for tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, rule passes from city to city, dynasty to dynasty. Every transfer is a mini reset. Kingship is taken from one place and given to another. It's tempting to take those pre-flood reign lengths literally and push civilization back hundreds of thousands of years. Some fringe histories do exactly that. But when you compare the exaggerated spans with later periods, where we also have more grounded records, a pattern appears. The deeper you go into the mythic past, the longer the reigns become. Numbers in the Near East often carry symbolic weight, multiples of 60 or 3,600 rather than precise chronology. So instead of a census of immortal god-kings, the king lists start to look like a political theology. There was an earlier world of perfect, divinely ordered rule. Then came the flood, a break. After that, successive worlds, the Kish world, the Uruk world, the Ur world, the Usin world. Each city's supremacy is treated as an era, a dispensation, framed as part of a cosmic script. And running through all of this are cyclical eschatologies that don't just end the story with destruction, but with renovation. In Zoroastrian thought, the universe unfolds in a vast, structured time span, often described in blocks, 12,000 years split into 4 3,000-year ages. Creation, mixture of good and evil, the long struggle, then the final renovation, the Frascogoretti. At the end there is fire, judgment, a river of molten metal that purifies the righteous and burns away evil. The dead are resurrected, the world is made fresh, and time as we know it stops, but not into nothingness, into a perfected, restored order. Other regional traditions echo this pattern. Not a simple line from creation to doom, but a curve. Creation, corruption, crisis, cleansing, renewed creation. The end is already wired into the beginning as a reset. Strip off the sacred language, and you're looking at social memories of cycles. Things get built up, get rigid, get unjust, and then get smashed. By war, by famine, by mass migration, by disease, or by all of them at once. The Assyrian world ends in siege and fire. The Hittite world ends in the Late Bronze Age collapse. The Achaemenid Persian world ends when Alexander walks in. For the people living through those transitions, that isn't a new administration. It's the end of everything they recognize. Myths of cycles give you a way to process that without going insane. If worlds end regularly, if heaven's favour moves on a schedule, if the cosmic plan includes collapse and renewal, then your suffering has a frame. You're not just unlucky, you're standing at the hinge between ages. Seen through that lens, 6 worlds before ours doesn't have to point to 6 technological civilizations with lost satellites. It can point to 6 major cycles of order and breakdown, each remembered, compressed and moralized into stories of ages, mandates, lists of kings, and promised renovations. And that matters, because when we go hunting for lost worlds in the physical record, craters, coastlines, ash layers, we're not just chasing rocks. We're also chasing the human habit of turning every political implosion and every failed harvest into the end of a world. By the time you get to the 19th and early 20th century, people aren't just inheriting these old stories of cycles and worlds. They're remixing them. Enter Theosophy and its cousins, big, ambitious, esoteric systems that look at all those myths of ages and floods and golden times and say, we can organise this. we can number it. Helena Blavatsky, writing in the late 1800s, doesn't just talk about humanity, she talks about root races. Not races in the modern sense of skin colour, but colossal stages of human and pre-human evolution spread over millions of years and multiple worlds. In her system, Earth goes through 7 great cycles. Each cycle hosts 7 root races. Each root race has 7 sub-races. It's spreadsheets all the way down. The first root race is basically ethereal, more like energy beings than anything we'd recognize as people. The second is still subtle. The third takes shape in Lemuria, a vanished continent in the Indian or Pacific Oceans. The fourth is Atlantean, living on a technologically and psychically advanced continent in the Atlantic that eventually sinks. The fifth is us, the so-called Aryan root race. The 6th and 7th are coming in the future, more spiritual, more evolved, living on a transformed Earth. You can see why this caught on. It takes scattered motifs, antediluvian worlds, floods, golden ages, disappearing islands, and stitches them into a single master narrative. It sounds scientific because it loves numbers and pseudo-geology. It sounds spiritual because it talks about karma, reincarnation, hidden masters guiding evolution. It sounds inclusive because it quotes Hinduism, Buddhism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, Egyptian myth, you name it. It also lands at a very particular cultural moment. Geology has just blown open the age of the Earth. Darwin has made deep time and evolution mainstream. Archaeology is digging up Sumer, Egypt, the Indus. Telegraphs and steamships are connecting Europe to India and beyond. So suddenly Eastern wisdom is on the table. At the same time, industrialization is uprooting people and shredding traditional religious certainties. A system that says, don't worry, there's a hidden plan. Humanity moves through great cycles. Lemurians, Atlanteans, us, then higher forms, and your soul is slowly climbing the ladder. That scratches a lot of itches at once. From Theosophy and related occult movements, you get a powerful meme: civilizations come in numbered layers. First, second, third, we're the 5th or the 6th, or depending on the writer, the 7th. Atlantis and Lemuria aren't random legends anymore. They're official previous humanities in a grand sequence. The problem is, what happens when you try to line this up with rocks and bones? Modern geology shows no evidence for a continent-sized landmass in the middle of the Atlantic that rose and sank in the last couple million years. Plate tectonics doesn't work that way. Same for a vanished Lemuria stretching across the Indian Ocean. The name originally came from a 19th century biologist trying to explain lemur fossils, not from ancient scriptures. Archaeology, meanwhile, has a pretty good handle on when and where large-scale, state-level societies appear, a few thousand years ago, not hundreds of thousands. We see the evolution of tools, art, agriculture, writing, architecture. We see continuity. We do not see a global, industrial, or psychic super-civilization wiping itself so clean that it leaves no clear traces except in clairvoyant visions and channeled texts. That doesn't mean every myth of an earlier world is empty. It does mean that when someone says, "We are the 7th civilization preceded by Lemurians, Atlanteans, and 3 other psychic space people," you should ask a couple of hard questions. First, predictive power. Did this system anticipate discoveries we later made independently? Did Blavatsky's timelines predict hominin fossils in specific layers or regions? Did she forecast plate boundaries, radiometric dates, genetic lineages? Or did she retrofit scientific language of her day, like races and continents, onto visionary narratives? Second, falsifiability. What evidence would count against the claim? If no sunken continent is found, the answer is often it was more subtle, or it existed on a higher plane, or the records were destroyed. If every conceivable geological and archaeological test can come back negative and the theory survives untouched, then it's not really about the physical past anymore. It's a metaphysical story that wears a historical costume. That doesn't make it worthless. Stories can carry psychological and moral truths without being literal maps of prehistory. But if we're asking, how many technological civilizations have actually existed on this planet? Then we have to separate symbolic cycles from testable ones. And here's the twist. When you hear someone on YouTube or in a book say, "We are the seventh civilization," they're often drawing, consciously or not, on this theosophical scaffold. 7 root races, 7 epochs, vanished advanced worlds. Then they blend in bits of Hindu Yugas, Hopi prophecies, biblical dispensations, modern UFO lore, and a dash of ancient aliens. It feels ancient because it cites ancient names, but as a numbered global 7-stage history of Earth, it's mostly modern. A late 19th and 20th century synthesis, not a single consistent teaching preserved from the dawn of time. So when we go looking for 6 worlds before ours, we need to be clear about what we're hunting. Are we chasing esoteric ages mapped by occultists? Are we chasing mythic cycles of order and collapse? Or are we asking a much harsher question? If another truly advanced civilization had risen and fallen before ours, what scars would it have left on the planet? And can we find them? If you're looking for a real-world candidate for a planetary reset button, you don't have to invoke psychic Atlanteans or fifth root races. You just have to roll the clock back about 12,900 years. The Ice Age is ending. Global temperatures have been rising out of the last glacial maximum. Massive ice sheets are retreating across North America and Eurasia. Sea levels are creeping up, ecosystems are shifting, big mammals are tracking the changing climates, and human groups are experimenting with new ways of living, more settled camps here, early plant management there. Then, very suddenly on geological timescales, the trend slams into reverse. This interval is called the Younger Dryas. Instead of a smooth warming into the nice, relatively stable Holocene climate we enjoy today, the Northern Hemisphere, especially around the North Atlantic, snaps back into near-glacial conditions. Average temperatures in some regions may have dropped by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius in just a few decades. That's not a gentle cooling, that's places you could farm become places you struggle to survive within the span of a couple of human lifetimes. Glaciers that had been shrinking stabilize or re-advance. Permafrost spreads, forests die back and are replaced by tundra and steppe. Rainfall patterns shift, rivers change their behavior. Whole ecosystems are rearranged. If you're a hunter-gatherer depending on seasonal migrations of animals and plants that follow specific climate cues, this doesn't just feel like the weather is weird, it feels like the world has broken. This is exactly the kind of event that could get remembered in distorted form as a previous world ending. Megafauna take a massive hit around this time. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, the whole Ice Age cast of characters in the Americas, and parts of Eurasia is thinning out or vanishing. There's a long, messy debate about how much of that is climate stress and how much is human hunting pressure, but almost everyone agrees the Younger Dryas is part of the stress package. For humans, this is both disaster and opportunity. Groups that had begun flirting with sedentary life based on wild cereals in the Near East. People we often call the Natufians are suddenly living in a cooler, drier environment with less predictable harvests. Some evidence suggests they were pushed back into more mobile foraging. Others may have doubled down, intensifying plant management, tending stands of grain more carefully, experimenting with storage. In some models, this very shock is one of the nudges that pushes people toward deliberate cultivation, and eventually agriculture. In other regions, humans adapt in different ways, diets broaden. Toolkits diversify. Groups move, split, merge, and relocate to better refuges. Some lineages die out, others expand rapidly. Once conditions improve again about 11,700 years ago, when the Younger Dryas ends as abruptly as it began, and the Holocene's relative stability kicks in. From inside that experience, what does it feel like? Your grandparents tell you about a time when rivers ran differently, when certain valleys were green that are now frozen or barren. Your parents talk about starving winters and confused animal migrations. You grow up in a harsher, angrier world than the one they describe. Then in your old age, things start to thaw and soften again. Compress that into story, and you don't get a small perturbation in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. You get, once, the world was warm and generous. Then, there was a great cold. Animals died, people scattered, old ways ended. After a long time, the world was remade. Exactly the sort of narrative that can, over thousands of years, morph into myths of ages, suns, or worlds being destroyed and renewed. Scientifically, what caused the Younger Dryas is still argued over, but one leading family of explanations doesn't require anything exotic. As the big North American ice sheets melted, vast volumes of fresh water pooled in proglacial lakes. If a huge pulse of that cold fresh water suddenly drained into the North Atlantic through an outburst flood or a rerouting of meltwater, it could have disrupted the ocean's heat conveyor belt, the circulation system that moves warm surface water north and brings cold deep water south. Shut down or severely weaken that circulation, and the North Atlantic region cools dramatically, even while the planet as a whole is still emerging from the Ice Age. This kind of ocean circulation flip is supported by multiple lines of evidence: changes in deep-sea sediments, isotopes in ice cores, shifts in pollen records. Other triggers have been proposed: volcanic activity, changes in solar output, and most dramatically the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the idea that fragments of a comet or asteroid exploded over the ice sheets or continents, igniting wildfires, injecting dust and soot into the atmosphere, and kicking off the cooling. That one we'll dig into in the next section, because it connects directly to modern lost civilization stories. For now, the key point is this: the Younger Dryas is real, sharp, global-scale climate weirdness. It's not a mood, it's a measurable spike in ice cores, in lake sediments, in fossil pollen, in glacial geology. Does that mean it's the smoking gun for a wiped-out, advanced civilization? Almost certainly not in the way Atlantis-style narratives imagine. We do see cultural disruptions and shifts around this period. Some stone tool traditions end, others appear. Settlements move. In a few regions like the Levant, there's evidence for demographic stress. Sites are abandoned, diets change. But we don't see the archaeological footprints you'd expect from a truly high-tech global culture. No sudden layer of industrial debris, no planetary-scale mining scars, no worldwide synchrony of urban collapse, because there are no confirmed cities yet to collapse. What the Younger Dryas can plausibly explain is a sense of rupture. It's a credible candidate for why so many traditions, thousands of years later, carry memories of a time when climates went haywire. Animals vanished, seas and rivers changed, and humans had to rethink how to live. It's a natural reset button that actually exists in the data. But if there were earlier, sophisticated human societies nudged or knocked down by this event, they'd still have to fit inside the physical evidence we have. Small-scale, regional, built mostly from perishable materials, leaving faint traces on landscapes that were then chewed up by glaciers, floods, and rising seas. The Younger Dryas gives us a real, testable example of a world on the edge, flipping into a new state. It shows that abrupt climate shocks aren't just mythic, they're part of Earth's operating system. And it sets the stage for the next question. Was this climate whiplash driven only by ice and oceans, or was something more violent, the impact of something from space, also in play? The impact idea starts with a simple cinematic picture. You're standing on a late Ice Age landscape. To the north, an ice sheet taller than skyscrapers. To the south, forests, grasslands, and the camps of hunter-gatherers. Overhead, a comet that's been slowly breaking apart on its long orbit finally crosses Earth's path. Fragments hit the atmosphere over North America and maybe other regions. Some pieces explode in the air like gigantic nuclear weapons without the radiation. Others slam into the ice, rock, or shallow seas. Shock waves flatten forests. Fireballs ignite continent-scale wildfires. Melted ice and rock rain back down as glassy droplets. Dust, soot, and water vapour are hurled high into the atmosphere, dimming sunlight, disrupting climate, and triggering the Younger Dryas cold snap. That, in a nutshell, is what proponents of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis are proposing. It's not just a rock hit us, it's a complex scenario, a fragmented comet or asteroid swarm, multiple airbursts and impacts over the Laurentide ice sheet, and maybe other targets, global wildfires, rapid cooling, and a cascade of effects on megafauna and human societies. So what's the evidence they point to? One major line is a strange layer found at many sites roughly dated to the Younger Dryas onset. In sediments, ice cores or soil horizons, researchers have reported a thin band enriched in things you don't normally see in those concentrations: microscopic spherules of melted rock and metal, bits of glassy carbon, magnetic grains, nanodiamonds, and elevated levels of elements like platinum. The claim is that this is an impact layer fallout from high-energy cosmic explosions that flash-melted surface materials and sprayed them across continents. Supporters argue that similar features are seen at known impact boundaries, like the one associated with the dinosaur-killing Chicxulub event. They also point to charcoal peaks and soot in many cores and lake records around 12,900 years ago, which they interpret as evidence of massive synchronous wildfires. In their model, the sky literally rained fire, continents burned, and all that smoke and black carbon helped cool the planet by blocking sunlight and darkening ice, changing how it absorbed heat. On top of that, some impact proponents link the timing of this supposed event to the decline of Clovis stone tool traditions in North America, and to pulses of megafaunal extinction. Their narrative is, first the skies fall, then ecosystems crash, then human cultures reorganize or disappear. On paper, it's a dramatic, coherent story. But science doesn't stop at dramatic and coherent. It asks, can other people find the same signals with the same methods at the same times, and rule out other explanations? That's where the critiques cut in. For almost every type of evidence claimed, other teams have had trouble replicating the findings consistently. Some labs do find spherules, nanodiamonds, and platinum anomalies. Others sample nearby layers with similar techniques and report no unusual concentrations. Or they find similar features in layers that have nothing to do with the Younger Dryas at all. Critics argue that many of these supposed impact markers can be produced by more mundane processes. Intense wildfires can generate microspherules and certain forms of carbon. Volcanic eruptions can scatter glassy particles and weird chemistry across wide areas. Normal sedimentary processes can concentrate or dilute metals and minerals in ways that mimic spikes if you're not careful about sampling. Then there's the charcoal. Yes, there's evidence for fires around the onset of the Younger Dryas, but there is also evidence for lots of fires at many other times. Humans had been burning landscapes for tens of thousands of years. Lightning, droughts, and climate swings all drive fire regimes. The question isn't, were there fires? It's, do the fires at 12,900 years ago look like something unlike anything before or after? That's still debated. Dating is another huge headache. You're often trying to line up thin layers in lake mud, peat bogs or soil with the precise start of the Younger Dryas, as seen in Greenland ice cores. But those different records have their own uncertainties, wiggles and calibration issues. An impact layer that looks like it lines up in one dating model can drift a few hundred years earlier, or later if you tweak assumptions. For a rapid event hypothesis, those few centuries matter. And then there's the dog that hasn't barked, a confirmed crater of the right age and scale. Supporters sometimes point to structures like the Hiawatha crater under the Greenland ice sheet as candidates, but the dating there is still unresolved, and many geologists think it's significantly older than the Younger Dryas. Others argue that if the impacts were mostly airbursts over ice, they wouldn't leave classic craters. That's possible, but it also makes the hypothesis harder to nail down. The more ephemeral your proposed mechanism, the more you have to lean on subtle geochemical signals that are themselves disputed. So where does that leave us right now? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis sits in a kind of scientific limbo. It's not accepted as mainstream fact. Many paleoclimatologists and geologists think ocean circulation changes, driven by meltwater pulses, plus internal climate variability, explain the cooling just fine without help from space rocks. At the same time, the impact idea hasn't been conclusively killed. New studies still appear on both sides, some reinforcing particular signals, others dismantling them. If an impact or series of airbursts were eventually confirmed with rock-solid dating, clear markers and broad replication, it would be a big deal. It would tell us that even relatively small human populations transitioning toward agriculture had to cope with not just gradual climate change, but literal catastrophe from the sky. It would strengthen the case that abrupt cultural and ecological shifts around 12,900 years ago had an extra kick, beyond ice sheets and ocean currents. But notice what it wouldn't automatically prove. It wouldn't show that there was a global, technologically advanced civilization wiped off the map. You'd still need independent evidence for that. Large, dense populations, complex infrastructure, long-distance trade systems, the material footprint that complex societies leave behind. A cosmic impact can be part of the cause of disruption, without implying there were skyscrapers and power plants in the line of fire. This is where it's useful to separate two different appetites. One is the human hunger for a story, a single, stunning event that explains extinctions, climate whiplash, cultural change, and maybe even our myths of worlds destroyed. The other is the slow, frustrating appetite of science, careful measurements, messy datasets, competing models and conclusions that shift as new evidence comes in. You don't have to give up the mystery to be intellectually honest. You can say there really was a violent climatic turn called the Younger Dryas. There might have been an extra shove from something in space. The evidence is intriguing in places, shaky in others, and actively being tested. If it pans out, it will change how we think about that period. If it doesn't, we still have a dramatic natural story involving ice sheets, oceans and feedback loops that's plenty wild on its own. And in both cases, the core fact stands. Humans alive at the time went through something so intense that it could plausibly echo down into stories of worlds destroyed, ages ending, suns going dark. Which brings us to another puzzle from exactly this window in time. While the climate was seesawing, someone on a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey was hauling multi-ton stones into circles, carving animals into them, and building a place that looks suspiciously like a ritual complex thousands of years before Stonehenge or the pyramids. Göbekli Tepe, the site that forced archaeologists to redraw the timeline of what civilized humans were capable of and when. Göbekli Tepe sits on a low hill in southeastern Turkey, looking out over what would once have been rich hunting grounds and seasonal pastures. It doesn't look like much from a distance now, just mounds and scrub and excavation pits. But under that soil is the reason a lot of archaeologists had to quietly eat their old lecture notes. For decades, the basic story went like this. First, people settle down and farm. Farming creates food surpluses. Surplus allows population growth, specialization, social hierarchies. Then, and only then, do you get the spare time and labor to build big monuments and complicated ritual centers? Villages, agriculture, temples. That was the staircase. Göbekli Tepe blew a crater in that staircase. Radiocarbon dates from the deepest, most impressive layers put its main construction around 9,600 to 8,800 BCE. That's right at the end of the Younger Dryas, over 11,000 years ago. Thousands of years before Stonehenge, thousands of years before the first cities of Mesopotamia. It belongs to people we still classify as hunter-gatherers. And yet these simple foragers were dragging 10 to 20-ton limestone pillars out of local quarries, erecting them in circular or oval enclosures up to 20 meters across, and carving them with foxes, boars, snakes, birds, abstract symbols, even headless humans. Some pillars are T-shaped with arms and belts, like stylized giants turned to stone. This is monumentality, not a random pile of rocks. Planned architecture with shared design rules, repeated across multiple circles on the same hill. What do we actually know, and what's still guesswork? The dating is pretty solid. Multiple radiocarbon samples from buried fill and associated materials cluster in the early Holocene. The basic layout is clear, a series of ring-like enclosures with central pillars, surrounded by smaller pillars and walls, some phases more massive and refined, later ones smaller and cruder. We know there are no clear domestic features in the main, early enclosures. No hearths for cooking, no trash middens piled with everyday waste. No obvious houses, that's part of why most researchers see Göbekli Tepe as a special purpose place, probably ritual. We know it didn't just sit and decay. At various points, people deliberately buried entire enclosures with tons of rubble and soil, then built new ones nearby or on top. That's strange behavior. It suggests carefully managed life cycles of sacred spaces, not just abandonment. We also see evidence that this wasn't a tiny, isolated shrine. The style of carvings and pillars has echoes at other sites in the region. Similar stone pillars and iconography show up at places like Karahan Tepe and other T-pillar sites still being uncovered. That hints at a wider cultural horizon, a network of groups sharing a symbolic language across a landscape. What we don't know is exactly who ran this show, how they organized labor, or what stories they told under those stones. Were there seasonal gatherings of scattered bands, converging for feasts, marriages, and ritual? Did certain lineages or shamans control access to the sacred hill? Was there already a kind of proto-priesthood people, whose authority rested on managing ceremonies and myths? Those are live debates. The social structure is inferred, not excavated. No written records, no obvious palaces, no clear elite burials. But whatever the details, Göbekli Tepe forces us to rethink the order of operations. Maybe people didn't start building big symbolic complexes because they had already become farmers. Maybe they started experimenting with farming because they had big symbolic complexes to feed. If you're pulling dozens or hundreds of people together for major rituals several times a year, you suddenly care a lot about predictable food supplies. Grain plots and managed herds become attractive. The temple first, agriculture later idea turns the old model upside down. Shared ritual spaces as engines driving the need for more reliable production, not just as byproducts of it. And notice what we don't see at Göbekli Tepe. No metal, no concrete, no lost miracle alloys. The tools are flint blades, stone hammers, simple levers and sledges. With enough hands, ropes and patience, you can move 20-ton blocks. It's brutal, but it's not magic. Modern experimental archaeology has shown small crews can drag multi-ton stones with basic gear if the ground is prepared. The sophistication here is social and symbolic, not technological in the sci-fi sense. That's exactly why Göbekli Tepe has become a magnet for prior civilization narratives. It looks like something that shouldn't exist yet in the old textbook model. So some people leap to the idea that these hunter-gatherers must have inherited knowledge from an earlier lost high-tech culture wiped out in the Ice Age. But you don't have to import an Atlantis to explain what we actually see in the ground. You just have to accept that cognitively modern humans with rich symbolic lives were around long before neat, rectangular cities. Given enough time, enough people, and strong shared beliefs, small-scale societies can build big things. Göbekli Tepe shows that the desire to make meaning with stone can appear before the plough, before the city wall, before writing. That said, the mystery isn't closed. Excavations so far cover only a fraction of the hill. Ground-penetrating surveys suggest dozens more enclosures or structures waiting under the soil. Nearby sites from the same period are only starting to be dug. Somewhere in those layers might be more mundane features, workshops, camp areas, storage pits, maybe early experiments in herding or cultivation. We might find clearer evidence of feasting, animal bone piles, brewing setups, specialized tools that shout ritual barbecue festival. We might find more regional sites that show how far this cultural style spread and how fast it evolved. As that picture sharpens, Göbekli Tepe will either look more and more like the spectacular ritual heart of a forager farming frontier or something even stranger. Either way, it shows that right after the chaos of the Younger Dryas, humans were already using stone and story to reshape their world. And that raises the next question. Once you've got ritual centers and seasonal gatherings, how long does it really take before fields, villages and cities start appearing around them? When you zoom out and look at the early Holocene, one pattern jumps out immediately. Göbekli Tepe isn't a lone freak event. All over the world, in a surprisingly tight window of time, humans start doing something new with plants and animals. In the Fertile Crescent, not far from Göbekli Tepe, people begin tending wild stands of einkorn and emmer wheat, rye barley. Over a couple of thousand years, you can literally see the grains change in the archaeological record. Wild varieties have brittle husks and shattering seed heads that scatter easily. Domesticated ones don't. They hold on to their seeds, making them easier to harvest, but less suited to surviving without us. That's evolution under human fingers. But it's not just Southwest Asia. In China, people start domesticating millet in the north and rice in the Yangtze Basin. In New Guinea, there's evidence of early taro and yam cultivation. In the Americas, you get squash and maize and beans domesticated independently. In West Africa, sorghum. In the Sahel, pearl millet. In the Andes, potatoes and quinoa and camelids. Different continents, different species, different cultures. Same general time frame, after the ice retreats, during the relatively stable climate of the Holocene. If you were looking for a sign that human ingenuity is a universal feature, not a local accident, this is it. Give cognitively modern humans a few thousand years of relative climate stability, and they will start hacking ecosystems. But the move from we're tending these plants to we're running a civilization is not instant. There are bottlenecks, hard ceilings you keep hitting. The first one is simple, surplus. Early farming is risky and backbreaking. You invest months of labour in soil you hope won't flood, dry out, or get eaten by pests. Hunter-gatherers can walk away from a bad patch. Farmers can't. It takes a long time before yields are consistently high enough that you're feeding more than just the people in the fields. Once you do get reliable surplus, the next constraint is organisation. Villages appear, clusters of houses, storage pits, maybe a communal building or two. You can see this in places like Jericho, Çatalhöyük, early Chinese Neolithic sites. Hundreds of people living together year-round. At that scale, you don't quite need a state, but you do need rules. Who controls the water? Who distributes grain in a lean year? Who decides where new houses get built? Those decisions leave faint archaeological traces, shared walls, standardized house plans, central granaries, but they don't yet scream bureaucracy. The real step into what we normally call civilization happens when information becomes just as important as grain. It's one thing to have a few hundred people and some fields. It's another to run irrigation over dozens of kilometers, coordinate planting schedules, track who owes what to whom, and mediate disputes between strangers who will never meet face to face. That's where writing shows up, not as poetry, as accounting. In Mesopotamia, the earliest proto-writing is little clay tokens and marks, representing quantities of grain, livestock, containers of oil. In Egypt, some of the earliest inscriptions are labels for goods and officials. In the Indus Valley, short repeated symbol strings on seals that probably tagged merchants, clans, or shipments. In early China, oracle bones and ritual inscriptions that sit on top of a whole apparatus of record-keeping and divination. Once you can freeze information outside a human brain, on clay, stone, bone, bark, you can scale administration. You can have taxes, rations, standardized weights and measures, law codes. You can send orders that outlive the person who wrote them. That's when cities become visible to us in a way earlier dense communities aren't. Durable architecture helps too. Mud brick is great for living in, terrible for impressing archaeologists 10,000 years later. Sun-dried bricks slump and melt back into the soil. Timber rots, that wipes out a lot of early complexity from easy detection. But once people start using fired brick, cut stone, massive earthworks, things change. City walls, stepped platforms, pyramids, stone temples, they survive. They anchor the story in rock. Uruk in Mesopotamia, early dynastic Egypt along the Nile, the planned cities of the Indus, Erlitou, and then Shang sites in China. They all announce themselves in the ground with big, stubbornly durable shapes. There's a climate backdrop to all of this that matters for our lost civilizations question. The Holocene, the last 11,700 years, is weirdly calm compared to the wild swings of the preceding Ice Age cycles. Temperatures wobble. Sure, there are regional droughts and cold snaps, but you don't see the same kind of brutal, rapid climate flips that hammered our ancestors during the Bottleneck period. Stable-ish seasons over many generations make betting on fields, canals, and permanent buildings less suicidal. If your planting calendar works for your grandparents and your grandchildren, you can start layering institutions on top of it. Property systems, religious hierarchies tied to flood cycles, legal codes about land and water. That baseline is crucial when we ask, could there have been a truly global, technologically advanced civilization tens of thousands of years before any of this? We know from the Holocene roughly how fast complexity can ramp up when conditions are favourable. Within a few thousand years of consistent farming in a region, cities and writing start to appear. Within a few thousand more you get empires. We also know what those leave behind. Thick layers of modified soil, vast networks of roads and canals, massive quarries and mines, enormous trash dumps, pollen records showing intense landscape modification, durable architecture in stone and fired materials scattered across hundreds of kilometers. If something comparable in scale and integration had existed 50,000 or 100,000 years ago, we'd expect at least some echo of that signal to have survived under later sediments in cave sequences in offshore cores, not intact cities, but weird blips, out-of-sequence metals, strange synthetic compounds, anomalous soil chemistry at scale. So far we don't see that. What we do see is a world where complex behaviour ramps up fast once climate calms down, and once people start tying themselves to fields and schedules. Multiple experiments in farming, multiple pathways to cities, all broadly consistent with what clever, symbol-using hunter-gatherers could build once the ice stopped jerking the rug out from under them every few centuries. Which brings us to a less visible frontier. The worlds that might have grown along the coasts and river deltas now drowned by post-ice age seas. If early Holocene people could create cities, we can still see inland what might have vanished under 120 meters of ocean. Start with one brutal, boring fact of physics. Ice melts, seas rise. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked up in ice sheets that global sea level was about 120 meters lower than today. Not a few meters, a skyscraper's worth. Pull that much water out of the oceans and entire countries appear. Continental shelves that are now good for oil rigs and submarine cables were dry land. Coastlines sat tens of kilometers farther out. River mouths were in completely different places. Huge, flat, well-watered plains existed where today there's nothing but blue. Now think about where humans like to live. If you're mobile hunter-gatherers in an unstable climate, shorelines are a dream. You get fresh water from rivers, marine resources from the shallows, terrestrial animals inland. Estuaries are nutrient bombs, mangroves, tidal flats, river deltas. These are the original all-you-can-eat buffets. There is no reason to think early Holocene or late Ice Age humans were stupid about this. On the contrary, every bit of evidence we have from later periods shows people clustering along coasts and rivers as soon as they can, which means that when the ice sheets started to retreat and the seas began their long, uneven rise, an enormous fraction of our most attractive real estate was sitting on the future seafloor. Sea level rise wasn't gentle, it came in pulses. Meltwater surges like Meltwater Pulse 1A around 14,600 years ago could push sea level up several meters in just a few centuries. That's within oral history range. You could literally have grandparents telling their grandchildren, "When I was a kid, the shore was over there, pointing at what's now underwater." So if you want to look for early villages, proto-towns, or just dense, semi-permanent camps from that transitional period when people were experimenting with plants, animals, and monuments, a lot of the best candidates are under the waves. Sundaland is one of the clearest examples. Today we see the islands of Sumatra, Borneo, Java, the Malay Peninsula, the shallow seas between them. During the low sea level world, all of that was mostly one vast subcontinent, linked to mainland Southeast Asia. Big rivers braided across wide plains, tropical forests cycled with savanna and wetlands as the climate shifted. It was a gigantic biodiverse, ecologically rich platform, basically Southeast Asia on easy mode. Genetic studies suggest Southeast Asia and Oceania were important corridors and refuges for humans and their cousins. Some of the deepest splits in modern human lineages show up in this region. Denisovan DNA echoes there. Rock art, stone tools and cave sites in nearby highlands hint at long, complex human histories. If anywhere could have supported large, dense populations of late Ice Age and early Holocene humans, people with boats, complex languages, social networks, sophisticated foraging strategies, Sundaland is near the top of the list. Not as a lost super-tech continent, but as a massive, now invisible heartland of ordinary, clever humans. And Sundaland is not unique. Doggerland once filled the North Sea between Britain and mainland Europe. Beringia bridged Siberia and Alaska. The Persian Gulf was a huge lowland basin. Around almost every continent, there are drowned valleys and plains that would have been prime habitat. So what can we actually do about it? This is where underwater archaeology comes in, and where the romance hits the engineering wall. Investigating submerged sites is hard and expensive. You're dealing with currents, poor visibility, depth limits for divers, the need for specialized remote vehicles and sonar. Sediment builds up fast in some places, burying whatever was on the old surface. In others, waves and currents scour and destroy. But hard isn't impossible. We already have some solid examples. Off the coast of India, there are submerged structures near the Gulf of Khambat, and at sites like Dwarka that show man-made walls and foundations from the mid-Holocene. Off the Carmel coast in Israel, the site of Atliti Yam preserves a Neolithic village, complete with stone houses, a well, and human burials, now under several meters of water. In the Black Sea, paleo shorelines with ancient river channels have been mapped, and occasional artifacts show up. Off Florida and in the North Sea basin, people have found lithic tools on the seafloor Ice Age technology where dry land once was. These finds are not secret Atlantean power plants. They are exactly what you'd expect. Normal human settlements, built in normal materials, caught by a shoreline that kept marching inland. And that's the key point. Submerged archaeology can absolutely change our story without jumping to flying machines and death rays. Imagine we start to systematically map continental shelves with high-resolution sonar, then target promising Paleoriver deltas and terraces. What might we find? We could push back the dates for permanent coastal villages in multiple regions. We might uncover early fish traps, harbours, wooden structures preserved in anoxic mud. We might find evidence of more intensive plant management or proto-irrigation along drowned river valleys. We could see that some areas developed dense, semi-urban communities earlier than we thought, just not in places that stayed above water. That would force us to rewrite the timeline of how fast complexity emerged. Maybe coastal Southeast Asia had town-like settlements before anything comparable in the interior. Maybe parts of the Persian Gulf basin hosted early irrigation experiments that later got replicated upstream when the waters rose. These are radical shifts in detail, not in physics, because there are reasonable boundaries on speculation here. If by civilization you mean people with pottery, planned villages, maybe simple writing or tally systems, seagoing boats, and regional trade networks, then yes, drowned coasts could absolutely have hosted civilizations that are currently invisible to us. Strong evidence would look like patterned stone foundations over large areas, standardized building plans, harbour works, large burial grounds, dense artifact scatters in submerged contexts, maybe even simple inscriptions preserved on durable materials. If by civilization you mean a truly global industrial or post-industrial society with advanced metallurgy, synthetic chemicals, complex machines, then the evidence requirements explode. You'd expect ore bodies massively depleted out of sequence, distinctive pollution signatures in ice cores and sediments worldwide, exotic alloys or plastics in deep strata, weird isotopic anomalies from large-scale energy use. We've looked pretty hard for those kinds of signals. They aren't there. So the honest middle ground is this. The oceans are hiding chapters of our story. They may well hold earlier, richer, more connected coastal worlds than anything we've dug up so far. But whatever was there still had to obey the same constraints we've been talking about. Limited surplus, fragile materials, local ecologies. If we ever do find a lost world on the seafloor, it will probably look less like a sci-fi Atlantis and more like Jericho by the sea. Still game-changing, still humbling, and still very much human. Which raises an uncomfortable follow-up. If whole regions of perfectly ordinary civilization can vanish under the waves in a few thousand years, what does that say about the long-term footprint of our own, far more intense, far more global world? Before we go any farther into drowned coasts and missing shorelines, we have to walk straight into the big one, Atlantis. Not the movie version, not the crystal-powered death laser version. The original, what we actually have, is not an ancient global tradition. It's two dialogues written by one guy in the 4th century BCE, Plato's Timaeus and Critias. In those texts, Atlantis isn't a mystery documentary. It's a teaching tool. The story shows up as a tale supposedly passed from Egyptian priests to Solon, then down through a chain of Athenian statesmen until it reaches Plato. Atlantis is described as a powerful island kingdom beyond the pillars of Heracles, roughly the Strait of Gibraltar, that grew rich, arrogant, and expansionist. At its peak, it tries to conquer the Mediterranean, including a virtuous, earlier Athens. The Athenians heroically resist. The gods punish Atlantis, and the island sinks in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods. Now look at what Plato is doing with it. He's writing after Athens has just been through empire, hubris, war, and collapse. His whole philosophical project is about justice, ideal states, and the dangers of moral decay. In that context, Atlantis is basically a thought experiment wrapped in a fake history. It's, here is what happens when a rich, powerful society forgets virtue and lets greed run the show. The numbers should already make you suspicious. The catastrophe is placed 9,000 years before Solon, which would shove Atlantis back to about 9,600 BCE. That's way before bronze, before classical-style cities, before anything remotely like Athens. Plato casually gives it a ringed capital with monumental works, a big navy, and complex administration. He's projecting the politics of his own world into the deep past to make a point about ethics, not offering field notes from an ancient survey mission. So why does Atlantis refuse to die? Because as a story, it's almost perfectly engineered. You get a super clear setting, one island, one capital, neat concentric rings. You get a clean arc, rise, corruption, punishment. You get catastrophe baked in. Earthquakes, floods, instant erasure. It's a morality play, a disaster movie, and a lost world mystery all rolled into one. It also does you a narrative favour that real prehistory rarely offers. It puts the entire previous world in one specific place. If all the mystery is on one island, then all you have to do is find that island and you unlock the secret of the ages. That's much more satisfying than the messy reality of 1,000 scattered sites, slowly accumulating pottery sherds, which is why people keep trying to park Atlantis on the map. Over the last couple of centuries, it's been found in the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Caribbean, off Cuba, in the middle of the Atlantic Ridge in Antarctica, under the Sahara, in Spain at Doñana, on Santorini, in the Black Sea, in Indonesia, basically anywhere you can draw a circle on a map and say, this sort of looks like rings. Some of these ideas are at least anchored to real events. The late Bronze Age eruption of Thera, Santorini, around 1600 BCE, absolutely devastated the Aegean and likely helped wreck Minoan civilization. You have a rich island culture, a colossal explosion, tsunamis, and later Greek memory of a seafaring people brought low by the sea. It's very reasonable to think elements of that disaster coloured later tales. The problem is that inspired by is not the same thing as is. Santorini does not match Plato's date, scale, or geography. Neither do most other candidates once you start checking against geology, archaeology, and the text itself. Claims of giant stone walls, lost harbours, or perfect city plans usually melt under closer inspection into natural formations, later historic ruins, or wishful pattern finding. That doesn't mean there was nothing behind the curtain. You can treat Atlantis in a few different ways without leaving the realm of sanity. As allegory, Plato invents a full-blown fictional state, loads it with his political and moral concerns, and uses the frame of Egyptian records to give it gravitas. In this view, Atlantis is no more historical than his ideal republic. As misremembered event, Plato, and the Greek world in general, inherit vague stories of earlier cataclysms, volcanic eruptions, floods, vanished islands, defeated sea empires. He stitches these together, scales them up, and sets them far back in time to separate them from immediate politics. As pure literary device, he wants a foil for ideal Athens, so he builds a kind of anti-Athens, pushes it offshore and into deep time, and destroys it when it's served its purpose. None of these require a literal sunken continent with an advanced global navy. So what would it take to move Atlantis from story to history? You would need multiple independent lines of hard evidence, all pointing to the same place, the same time window, and the same level of complexity Plato describes. That means extensive submerged ruins with clear human-made architecture on the scale of a large Bronze Age or earlier city, not just a few walls, but a planned urban layout with public works, docks, maybe fortifications, a material culture that is internally consistent and dates in a tight band, not scattered artifacts from many eras jumbled together, environmental signatures of a major sudden catastrophe at that location, tsunami deposits, earthquake faulting, rapid subsidence, all matching a plausible destruction horizon. Ideally, you'd have inscriptions or iconography tying that culture's name, myths or political structure to something recognizable in later Mediterranean traditions. You'd want corroboration from independent written sources, not all downstream of Plato. And you'd want the dates to make sense within real geology and archaeology, not rely on magical we can just move 9,000 to 900 numerology, unless you have hard evidence that scribal error really occurred. Until something like that shows up, the cautious stance is simple. Atlantis is an extraordinarily influential story. It might preserve distant echoes of real disasters and real drowned coasts. But as far as testable history goes, it sits on the unproven shelf. And in a way that's freeing, we don't need one perfect island to explain lost worlds. We have entire continental shelves, whole vanished lowlands and multiple real catastrophes to work with. Which brings us to the other great lost continents of modern imagination, places like Mu and Lemuria, where the line between speculation and pseudohistory really starts to blur. Mu and Lemuria are what happened when a couple of half-baked 19th century ideas refuse to die and then get reincarnated as entire lost worlds. Start with the science, or rather the pre-science. In the mid-1800s, geology and biogeography were still figuring themselves out. People knew fossils of similar animals showed up on continents, now separated by vast oceans. They knew there were lemurs in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East in between. They could see weird patterns of plants and animals, but they didn't yet have plate tectonics, seafloor spreading, or a good grasp of how continents move. So a very reasonable guess at the time was, maybe there used to be land in between. Scientists proposed land bridges to explain these puzzles, not magical crystal continents, just chunks of shallow seafloor that might have risen and sunk with slow changes in the Earth's crust. You see animals on both sides of a gap. Maybe there used to be a strip of land they walked across before it disappeared. From that context, you get two names. Lemuria starts as a technical speculation from zoologists like Philip Sclater, who in 1864 noticed this odd lemur distribution and suggested a lost land in the Indian Ocean. It was basically a placeholder. Something used to be here that connected these places. Mu comes a bit later in the 1870s, when Augustus Le Plongeon is trying to read the Maya and completely mangles things. He decides there was a lost continent called Mu in the Atlantic or Pacific that gave rise to Egyptian and American civilizations. His translation work doesn't survive modern linguistics. It's wishful thinking baked into bad philology. None of this is mystical yet. It's just 19th century people stretching limited data with the tools they had. Then the storytellers arrive, theosophists and later occult writers, look at these vague half-scientific proposals and do something very human. They fill in the blanks with whatever they find meaningful. Helena Blavatsky grabs Lemuria and turns it into a full stage in her scheme of root races, an ancient continent with its own spiritual civilization destroyed in some grand cataclysm. James Churchward inflates Mu into an enormous Pacific super-empire with advanced technology, colonies worldwide, and conveniently no surviving hard evidence because it all went under. What started as maybe there was once a land connection in this region becomes, here is a detailed, morally charged history of a vanished global culture. You can watch the gears turning, similar pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica. Must be Mu or Lemurian colonists, shared flood myths. Proof the same continent sank. Old symbols that sort of resemble each other if you squint. Cultural diffusion from the motherland. It feels neat. It compresses a messy, multi-origin, multi-contact human story into a single cause. Instead of dozens of independent inventions, parallel developments, and occasional long-distance voyages, you get one grand source civilization. It scratches the same itch Atlantis does, one answer, one map label, one secret key. Psychologically, that's extremely attractive. Our brains love patterns. We are biased to prefer simple, unified explanations over a lot of small, contingent ones. If someone says these cultures independently figured out pyramids because stacked shapes are stable, monumental, and symbolically powerful, that's plausible but boring. If someone else says, no, they all inherited sacred geometry from Mu, that gives you a story, a plot, and heroes. It feels like learning a secret. It also plays into a certain flattery. If there were ancient master civilizations, then we're not just random latecomers. We're heirs, either descendants of the wise ones or survivors of their fall. That can be oddly comforting even when the story is supposedly about collapse. The problem is that 20th century science quietly pulled the rug out from under the whole thing. Plate tectonics explains why distant continents share fossils and rock types. They were literally joined millions of years ago and then drifted apart on a moving lithosphere. You don't need a recent vanished continent to get the same trilobites in Africa and South America. There used to be the same landmass in the age of dinosaurs. Seafloor mapping shows that the big ocean basins, the deep parts where Mu and Lemuria are usually parked, are old, stable and thin. You don't get entire continent-sized chunks of thick, buoyant crust rising up and then vanishing into 4,000-metre depths in the last few 100,000 years without leaving clear geological scars, sediment disruptions and wild changes in sea level. We don't see those, biogeography fills in the rest. Species spread across land when continents are joined, across short sea gaps by rafting, swimming or island hopping, and evolve in isolation in exactly the ways Darwin and later researchers documented. Lemurs don't require a lost Lemuria. They require an earlier dispersal and a lot of evolution on Madagascar's island laboratory. So the modern picture doesn't just fail to support Mu and Lemuria, it actively contradicts the specific, continent-sized versions people imagine. There is no room in the physics of plates and the mapping of the ocean floor for a recent Atlantis-scale landmass in the mid-Pacific or Indian Ocean that rose, supported cities, and then catastrophically sank. But that's exactly why these stories are useful, not as history, but as training material. Notice the pattern, a real puzzle or gap in knowledge. A provisional, speculative idea from scientists trying to solve it. That idea gets frozen in time, yanked out of context, and turned into a foundation for grand narratives long after the science has moved on. Later evidence contradicts the original speculation, but the narrative lives on in books, documentaries, and YouTube videos. If you can learn to spot that sequence, you've just upgraded your claim detection hardware. Whenever you hear about a lost civilization, ask, what was the original problem this idea tried to solve? Have newer discoveries given us better explanations? Am I hearing the current scientific view, or a 150-year-old guess that's been mythologized? Are the details coming from data, or from one or two charismatic authors who keep citing each other? Mu and Lemuria remind us that scientific sounding doesn't always mean scientifically alive. Ideas can fossilize, then be reanimated as pseudo-history. And if you can keep that in mind as we move on to ancient high-tech claims, batteries, precision cuts, supposed machining, you'll be in a much better position to tell the difference between a real mystery in the evidence and a story that grew up in the empty spaces where our knowledge used to be thin. If Mu and Lemuria are what happen when old scientific guesses get turned into continents, ancient high-tech claims are what happen when real artifacts get ripped out of context and handed modern job descriptions. Let's walk through the greatest hits. People love to start with the Baghdad battery, a clay jar from around 200 BCE with a copper cylinder and an iron rod inside. Add an acidic liquid and, yes, you can get a tiny voltage. So is this a battery? That's the claim. Ancient electroplating, lost electrical tech, maybe even lights in Egyptian tombs. What do archaeologists actually say? First, nobody has ever found wires, switches, or anything like a power grid from that time and place. No sockets, no insulators, no descriptions in texts. Second, jars with metal bits in them also make decent ritual or storage vessels. The battery interpretation comes from a 1930s researcher who tried filling one with acid and was excited that a galvanometer twitched. Experimental archaeology shows you can make a crude battery out of it. But can isn't the same as did. There's no independent evidence they were used that way, and the voltages are so low you'd have a hard time doing serious plating. It's not proof of a hidden electrical age. It's an ambiguous object that happens to be compatible with many functions, including one that we find exciting because it resembles our tech. Next category, machining and precision. Here the stars are things like the allegedly lathe-turned vases from Egypt, the perfectly drilled granite cores, or the incredibly smooth flat stone surfaces in places like Peru. Videos zoom in on tool marks and say, this looks like it came off a CNC machine, therefore lost high technology. Mainstream view, ancient people were obsessively good at working with stone and metal using tools we already know they had. Copper and bronze chisels, stone pounders, sand abrasives, bow drills, wooden lathes, and a lot of time. This is where experimental archaeology really earns its keep. You take the toolkit we're confident existed at the time. You take the same kinds of stone, and you try. Want a machined granite block with flat faces and sharp corners. People have reproduced that with dolerite pounding stones, copper chisels and sand as an abrasive, given enough workers and weeks of labour. Want a drilled hole through hard rock with a spiral groove on the core? You can get that using a simple tubular copper drill, sand, water and a bow. The spiral pattern isn't a smoking gun for a steel drill bit. It's what happens when your tube wobbles as you rotate it by hand. Once you know how the marks are made, a lot of the mystery vanishes. Not because it was easy, but because it was possible with known tools plus skill and patience. And that's the big distinction people often blur. Skilled craftsmanship versus industrial technology. Industrial tech isn't just precision, it's systems. It's iron or steel tools mass-produced in standardized forms. It's interchangeable parts, complex gearing, power sources that let you scale up, water mills, steam engines, electricity. It leaves behind slag heaps, soot layers, mining scars, tool catalogues in texts, and huge diverse waste streams. Skilled craftsmanship can reach astonishing levels with almost no machinery. Think about a Stradivarius violin, hand-carved with simple tools, sounding as good as anything made with lasers and CAD today. Or Japanese swordsmiths folding steel hundreds of times with charcoal forges and hammers. No one looks at a katana and says, "Must be alien metallurgy." We accept that humans, given time and incentive, can get very good at hard things. Where we get into trouble is presentism. We project our own technological learning curve backward. We assume that if we, personally, would need a power drill, a diamond saw, and a YouTube tutorial to shape a block of diorite, then any civilization that managed it must have had our kind of tools. We underestimate what thousands of specialists, trained from childhood, can do when that one task is their job, their status, their craft identity. At the same time, it's fair to ask, what would a truly anachronistic technology signature look like? Not a single ambiguous artifact, not one jar that could be a battery, or one stone that could be read as machine. A real technology leaves a constellation of traces that all point the same way. For an electrical civilization, we'd expect copper conductors in structured layouts, insulators, standardized fittings, maybe carbonized remains of coils. Distinctive corrosion patterns on metals that had carried sustained current, changes in ore extraction and smelting tied to huge demand. For advanced machining, we'd expect high carbon or alloy steels in tool shapes, grinding wheels made with consistent abrasives, lathe components, gears with regular tooth profiles, microscopic tool marks that match modern cutting geometries, not just smoothness. For any kind of fossil fuel or large-scale mechanical tech, we'd expect soot signatures in ice cores and sediments, rapid spikes in certain metals, weird isotope ratios, big mining voids that don't match known Bronze or Iron Age methods. In other words, networks, infrastructure, waste wear, and unintended byproducts. Not just one sexy object in a museum case. So when you hear about ancient high-tech, you can run the same checklist you used for Mu and Lemuria. Is this one artifact being asked to carry an entire story? Have people tried to reproduce it with period tools, and what did they find? Are we confusing, "I don't know how to do that," with "no human could do that"? And if this really reflects a whole hidden technology, where's the rest of the ecosystem that tech would require? Because when we go looking for vanished worlds, the most convincing evidence isn't the spectacular. It's the boring, repeated, consistent traces of a way of life. And that brings us straight to the question of big stone projects, pyramids, megaliths, precision joints, and whether those are really signatures of something beyond the civilizations we already know. Let's start with the pattern everyone notices but rarely explains. Huge stone projects show up all over the world. Egypt has pyramids. Mesoamerica has pyramids. Britain has stone circles. Peru has those interlocking walls. Cambodia has temple mountains. Easter Island has moai. Different cultures, different times, same basic move. Drag absurdly big rocks into specific shapes and spend generations perfecting them. This looks at first glance like a smoking gun for a single lost source of knowledge. Like somebody, somewhere, figured out how to do pyramids, and everyone else is just riffing on the template. But you don't actually need diffusion to get big stone monuments. You just need 3 ingredients that humans hit over and over again: surplus food, strong social hierarchies, and the desire to make something that screams, "We were here." Once you have farmers producing more grain than they personally eat, someone can skim off that surplus and feed specialists. Priests, rulers, architects, masons. Once you have rulers, you tend to get big, durable symbols of power. Earth is plentiful but erodes. Wood is easier but rots. Stone is a nightmare to work with, but lasts. If your ideology is "we are eternal," stone wins. And the shapes, piles and lines are the lowest tech way to reach for the sky. If you want to build tall and you don't have reinforced concrete or steel, a broad stone pyramid or stepped platform is the safest option. Stack heavy things with the widest base possible. If you want to mark territory or ritual space with the least amount of geometry knowledge, you do circles, rows, and alignments. Those patterns aren't evidence of a shared blueprint. They're what happens when human beings, with similar brains and physics, keep running the same architectural experiments. So how did they actually do it? Not by magic, not by lasers. By combining simple tools with staggering amounts of labour and time. We know a lot about the basics: quarrying hammerstones to detach blocks, wooden or metal wedges pounded into cut grooves, water poured in to swell the wood and crack the rock. In some places, fire setting, heat a boulder, then shock it with cold water so it fractures. Transport, sledges on lubricated tracks, rolling logs, wooden sleds dragged over wet clay, barges along rivers and canals, ramps of mud brick, rubble and limestone chippings, levers, pry bars, cribbing with wooden blocks, move the stone an inch at a time, reset, repeat. Labour organisation is where it really stops looking like cavemen and starts looking like a modern construction site. In Egypt we have worker villages, bakeries, breweries, medical care, payroll in bread and beer, and graffiti where crews named themselves things like the drunkards of Menkaure. At other sites we find standardised housing, evidence of scheduled deliveries of food and tools, burial grounds for the labourers. These weren't random slaves dying in chains. They were rotating corvée labourers, specialists, overseers, religious personnel. A whole project bureaucracy. Technology grows incrementally inside that system. You start with rough blocks. You discover that if you rub 2 blocks together with sand and water in between, both faces become flatter. You notice that plastering gaps wastes material, so you aim for tighter joints. You learn to quarry stones closer to final shape to save work on site. You standardize block sizes because that makes planning easier. Generations later, people wander through the ruins and assume there must have been a forgotten master equation of megaliths. There are real unknowns, to be fair. We don't have the owner's manual for Giza or a step-by-step guide for how Inca masons achieved such consistent polygonal joints at scale. For many sites we can outline the range of plausible methods, but not say they definitely used a straight ramp, not a spiral, or this specific team size with this exact schedule. There are also gaps in the workforce picture. How many workers were full-time specialists? How seasonal was the labour? How often did political or religious events slow or accelerate construction? Texts give hints, but for lots of projects the logistics are reconstructed from fragments, not from a complete accounting ledger. That's where the speculation creeps in, and it's where the word precision gets overused. If you cherry-pick the single best-fitted joint out of 10,000 and make that the thumbnail, you can tell a story of impossible perfection. If you actually walk around the site, you see a mix. Some joints are hairline tight, others are sloppy. Some blocks are beautifully squared, others are visibly irregular. The Great Pyramid is impressively aligned to the cardinal directions, but not perfectly. There's measurable error. The 90-degree corners are very good for their era, but they're not nanometer perfect. Tool marks are uneven. Surfaces vary in finish. In other words, this is exactly what you'd expect from human builders working very hard with limited tools, not what you'd expect from robot-grade industrial machining. And that's the interesting part. Not that they were too good, but that they were just good enough to tell us something about their societies. Monuments like these are receipts for social complexity. They imply a food system robust enough to support thousands of non-farmers, a political or religious ideology persuasive enough to keep people showing up year after year, knowledge transmission systems capable of preserving layout plans, rituals and engineering tricks over generations, long-distance trade for special stones, metals, resins, pigments. They also hint at motivation that goes beyond bare survival. People were willing to spend lifetimes on something they'd never see finished. That speaks to powerful myths, afterlives, ancestor cults, cosmic calendars. These structures are not just big puzzles, they're hard-coded values in stone. So when we look at pyramids, Cyclopean walls, and aligned megaliths, we're not seeing random anomalies that must be explained by a vanished, super-advanced world. We're seeing the upper limit of what pre-industrial agrarian civilizations can do when they pour their wealth into permanence. And that raises a new, sharper question for our 7 civilizations idea. If even Bronze Age farmers can reshape entire landscapes and leave monuments that last for millennia, what would it take for a truly global, technologically advanced civilization to vanish almost without a trace? To answer that, you have to inventory what the planet can actually throw at us. Not in a movie trailer way, in a geophysics way. Start with volcanoes. Most eruptions are local tragedies, a town buried, a valley choked with ash. Horrible but survivable for the wider world. Every so often, though, the system flips into civilization-level problem. On the low end of that scale, you get things like Tambora in 1815. One Indonesian volcano blows, half a world away, and Europe and North America get the year without a summer. Crop failures, famines, weird blood-red sunsets that terrified people who had no idea they were looking at the stratosphere full of ash. Go bigger, and you hit genuine volcanic winters. Toba, around 74,000 years ago, was one of those. A super-eruption so large it dropped up to several meters of ash across parts of India, injected sulfur into the stratosphere, and likely knocked global temperatures down for years. Did it almost wipe out humans? The older, dramatic Toba nearly killed us all story is under heavy revision now, but everyone agrees events on that scale have continental consequences. Crops fail, food webs crash, whole regions become temporarily uninhabitable. Now imagine you're running a fragile early farming society, clustered in river valleys, with 1 or 2 staple crops and no global trade network to bail you out. A decade of shorter growing seasons is not just a bad time. It's the end of your political system. Your monuments survive. Your writing might not. Then there's the ocean. Tsunamis are the most literal version of the coast is gone now. A big undersea earthquake, a landslide, or even a volcanic flank collapse can suddenly shove a column of water the size of a country. Close to shore, there's no time to run. Farther out, the wave can cross entire ocean basins and still arrive high enough to erase harbours, warehouses, fishing fleets, and all the little coastal villages that don't leave great stone foundations. We know this happens because we've seen baby versions. The Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 hit 14 countries, killed over 200,000 people and wiped out centuries of accumulated coastal infrastructure in a morning. Scale that up a bit. Put it somewhere like the Eastern Mediterranean 3,000 years ago, where most power centres are sitting on the water's edge. Add in fires, plague, and a few badly timed earthquakes. You get something that looks, from the archaeologist's point of view, like the floor just dropped out of an entire age, which in that case it kind of did. The Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE is a textbook case study in principle. You have a whole constellation of complex states: New Kingdom Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, city-states along the Levantine coast. They're trading metals, grain, timber, luxury goods. They're sending letters to each other complaining about delayed shipments. And then within a century or so, the system disintegrates. Palaces burn. Writing systems vanish from daily use in some regions for hundreds of years. Population drops. We get legends of sea peoples, of wandering raiders, of cities sacked by enemies whose names we don't even know anymore. What caused it? Probably not one thing. The evidence points to a stack: earthquakes rattling the Aegean and Anatolia, droughts stressing grain production, internal rebellions, raiding coalitions in the eastern Mediterranean, possible tsunamis hitting key ports. It wasn't a single hammer blow. It was a whole catastrophe toolbox being emptied out onto already brittle societies. From 3,000 years away, it looks like a world ending. If all we had from that era were a few scattered ruins, you could easily spin it into a lost global civilization that mysteriously vanished. Instead, we have just enough clay tablets and broken pottery to see it as a regional collapse inside a bigger continuous human story. That's the key thing disasters do to the archaeological record. They create discontinuities. You're digging in one layer. You've got nice pottery, fine masonry, writing, trade goods. Then, bang, you hit a burn layer or a tsunami deposit full of jumbled debris. Above that, for a while, the material culture is cruder. Fewer imports, simpler tools, smaller settlements. If you didn't know about famines, invasions, and earthquakes, it would be tempting to say, advanced people disappeared, and a totally different, more primitive group moved in. In reality, it's often the same population, minus its elites, trying to rebuild with whatever survived. And bits of knowledge do survive, in weird ways. A scribe's son remembers a handful of symbols and uses them for ritual long after real literacy is gone. Farmers keep planting the most reliable grains, even if they forget which royal decree standardized them. Sailors memorize coastal routes that their grandchildren will later mythologize as the paths of the gods. After the Late Bronze Age, Greece falls into what archaeologists actually call a dark age, where writing disappears and big palaces are gone. But oral tradition keeps some memory of the old world alive. Centuries later, that memory crystallizes into Homeric epic, stories of great walls, far ships, and a heroic age that feels almost like another world. From a distance, that's how previous civilizations often show up. Not as intact blueprints, but as fragments embedded in myth, half-remembered place names, odd technological holdovers that don't quite match the current level of complexity. Now apply that pattern to the 6 worlds before ours. You don't need 6 totally separate, galaxy-brain civilizations with flying machines and free energy. You can get something that feels like 6 different worlds just by letting the Catastrophe Toolbox work on human societies for long enough. Ice ages advance and retreat, sea levels rise and drown continental shelves, tsunamis redraw coasts, volcanoes dim the sun for a few bad years. Earthquake belts periodically shred cities that thought they were eternal. Each time, regional cultures crash, reconfigure, and forget pieces of their own past. To later people, looking back over only a few thousand years of memory, those layers can feel like discrete ages of the world. The builders of the great stones, the people before the flood, the sailors before the sea rose, the empire that vanished in fire. Stack enough of those on top of each other, spread them around the globe, and the mythic idea of 6 worlds before ours starts to look less like pure fantasy and more like a poetic way of talking about something very real. A planet that keeps resetting the board while one stubborn, inventive primate tries, over and over again, to rebuild. If you push the 6 worlds before ours idea to its extreme, you don't just get regional palace networks and sea trade cultures. You get the Atlantis fantasy turned up to 11, a truly advanced planet-spanning civilization that rose and fell long before Sumer or Egypt. Metal ships on every ocean, power systems we don't understand, maybe even something industrial. If anything like that had existed, what should it have left behind? Start with the boring stuff, not crystal skulls and mystery monoliths. Dirt, rocks, chemistry. Every large-scale technological society we know about is, in geological terms, incredibly loud. They dig, a lot, mines for metals, quarries for stone, open pits for fuel. They move entire hillsides to get at copper, tin, iron, rare elements. They leave tunnels that spider through mountains and gigantic scars you can still see from orbit thousands of years later. They also make trash. If you smelt ore, you get slag, the glassy, useless leftovers from pulling metal out of rock. Ancient slag heaps from Bronze Age copper production in places like Cyprus and Oman are still sitting there, meters deep. Roman lead and silver mines in Spain left waste piles big enough to map from space. Even much older, smaller-scale operations leave distinctive chemical signatures in nearby soils and sediments. Scale that up to a global empire. You're talking millions of tons of extracted metal. Multiple continents' worth of quarries and pits, rivers and lake beds downstream from mines, laced with unusual concentrations of lead, copper, arsenic, tin. Layers of slag buried in floodplains and deltas. Those don't just vaporize because a culture collapses. They get buried, and burial, geologically, is often how things are preserved. Then there's what you do with all that metal and energy. Combustion leaves fingerprints. Burn a lot of coal or oil, and you put specific ratios of carbon isotopes into the atmosphere. Those isotopes show up in tree rings, in cave formations, in the tiny bubbles of ancient air trapped in glaciers. Our own industrial age has written such a clear chemical signature into ice cores that future geologists will be able to date our era almost to the decade. Nuclear technology is even louder. Split atoms in large quantities, and you create radionuclides that basically don't exist naturally in any significant amount. Plutonium-239, cesium-137. These get spread by wind and water, absorbed into sediments at the bottom of lakes and oceans, fixed into corals. They have half-lives long enough to be detectable for tens of thousands of years, in some cases much longer. Now, it's possible that a hypothetical prehistoric civilization never went that route. No fossil fuels, no fission, nothing that looks like our particular industrial stack. But even then, large centralized states tend to reshape ecosystems in ways that are archaeologically obvious. Domestication is one of the big ones. When humans take a plant or animal and breed it for their own purposes, they push its evolution down a weird, accelerated path. Seeds get bigger, horns shrink. Wolf skulls become dog skulls. Genes for tameness, for fat content, for fiber length all get favoured and spread. Those changes don't disappear when the civilization does. The species keep carrying them. Wheat is not going to quietly revert to wild einkorn overnight, just because palace scribes stopped paying the grain tax. Cattle and goats don't spontaneously undomesticate on a planetary scale. You would expect to see in the genetic record lineages of plants and animals that show intense artificial selection, spread widely, and then nothing. A ghost distribution of former domesticates appearing in caves and middens long before our known Neolithic. Instead, the story we see is messy but continuous. Early domestication centres in the Fertile Crescent, China, New Guinea, the Americas. Multiple independent experiments in turning wild species into human tools. No obvious missing wave of globally standardized crops and livestock from 50,000 or 200,000 years ago. Could some traces still have vanished? Absolutely. Coastlines are murder on memory. Sea level has risen about 120 meters since the last glacial maximum. That's not just a few beaches, that's entire coastal plains, river deltas and continental shelves drowned. If you put your hypothetical advanced culture's big cities right on those fertile now submerged lowlands, a huge fraction of their architecture and artifacts would be underwater, buried under sediments, and very hard for us to find with a tiny fraction of the seafloor we've actually surveyed. Tropical environments are almost as bad. Heat, humidity, and active soils shred organic remains. Wood, fibre, even many metals corrode or rot away in a few thousand years. Dense forests can hide earthworks and foundations surprisingly well. We're still discovering lost cities in Amazonia and Southeast Asia that were flourishing just a millennium or two ago. But even in those harsh environments, some things do hang on. Pottery fragments, glass, burn layers, chemical anomalies in peat bogs and lake mud. Pollen records showing sudden shifts in vegetation due to deforestation or agriculture. If somebody was clearing entire continents, mining at industrial scales, and running a world system that stitched multiple regions together, you'd expect to see weird synchronized blips in those records, a spike of deforestation here, metal pollution there, all lining up in time across hemispheres. So far, the data don't show that. They show plenty of local and regional impacts, ramping up in the Holocene as farming spreads and states form. They show earlier, smaller signatures of controlled fire and hunting pressure going back hundreds of thousands of years. But not a clear global civilization horizon before the one we're in. This is where the strongest skeptics of hidden advanced civilizations are coming from. Not from a place of nothing is possible, but from the simple observation that Earth is a very nosy archivist. It tends to keep receipts. If there had been a civilization with energy use, mining and agriculture comparable to, say, the Roman Empire scaled up to the whole planet, there should be a long list of things we're tripping over constantly. Anomalous mine systems in very old rock layers, inexplicable global pollution spikes, domesticated species out of place in deep time, sediments laced with byproducts we don't otherwise see until the last few thousand years. We don't see that, at least not yet, and that's a serious argument against the Atlantis but global picture. But that doesn't mean the only alternative is nothing interesting ever happened before writing. There's a big middle ground. It's entirely plausible that there were cultures that were advanced for their time, concentrated along coasts and rivers we've barely sampled, that had seafaring, complex trade networks, maybe even forms of monumental architecture in perishable materials. Think of something like the Bronze Age Aegean, but a bit earlier, and built mostly in wood and earth instead of stone. Think of city-states strung along the now submerged shorelines of Sundaland or the Persian Gulf Basin, when sea level was lower, moving obsidian, shells, dried fish, ideas. A network like that could be crucial in spreading crops, myths and technologies that later show up suddenly in the archaeological record, without leaving us neat stone ruins to label. It could absolutely seed the memories that later turn into stories about people before the flood, or builders who vanished. From the planet's point of view, though, even those cultures would be small ripples compared to what we're doing now. They might leave enough traces that a dedicated lucky science can eventually piece them together, but not enough to look like a prior global empire with its own industrial revolution. So when we talk about worlds before ours, we're probably not choosing between a completely empty prehistory and 6 Atlantean super-civilizations. We're looking at a spectrum, many layers of regional complexity. Some of them surprisingly sophisticated, some of them now under 100 meters of water or a jungle canopy, all of them subject to the same human bottleneck we are. Big empires write themselves loudly into the rocks. Smaller, earlier experiments in complexity can whisper, and it's those whispers we're still struggling to hear. So where does that leave the whole "we are the seventh civilization" idea? On one side you've got the myths, counting worlds and ages like beads on a string. 4 suns, 5 yugas, 5 ages of man, 7 root races. On the other side, you've got geology and archaeology, counting ice ages and sediment layers and radiocarbon dates. They look like they're talking past each other. One speaks in symbols, the other in spreadsheets. But if you squint the right way, they might both be describing something real, just in totally different languages. When ancient traditions say this is the 5th sun, or we live in the Kali Yuga, the last and worst age, they're not compiling a peer-reviewed timeline of lost continents. They're making a claim about quality, not quantity. About moral atmosphere, not satellite coverage. A world in that sense is an era with a feeling. A time when the rules of the game shift. Gods behave differently. People are better or worse. Violence rises or falls. Knowledge is closer or farther away. Science has its own worlds, but we call them by duller names: glacial maximums, interglacials, pluvials, drought phases, Heinrich events. From a species point of view, those aren't just weather reports. They're existential reboots. Coastlines move. Forests turn to grasslands and back. Entire ways of life go extinct because the climate regime they depended on simply stops existing. You can line these up. One world could be the relatively stable climate that let big Pleistocene megafauna dominate, and hunter-gatherers organize around following them. Another world is the Younger Dryas crash, a sudden snapback to near-glacial conditions right when humans were experimenting with more settled lifeways. Another world is the Holocene sweet spot, 10,000 years of unusually stable climate that's basically the operating system for everything we call civilization. On top of that, you can add cultural resets, the Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Late Antique Little Ice Age, the Black Death, moments when networks implode, stories change, and people look back and say, the old world ended. We live in a different one now. Are those exactly the same as the Vedic Yugas or Mesoamerican Suns? No, but they rhyme in an interesting way. Myth is taking messy, overlapping climate, ecological and social shifts and compressing them into a countable number of worlds that rise, decay and end. In that sense, we might be the 7th civilization or the 70th, depending on how fine-grained you want to slice it. We're clearly not the first culture to build monuments, cities, trade networks and complex myths about people even older than themselves. At the same time, we are living through something genuinely new in Earth's story, a species that can rewire the entire planet's energy flows and chemical cycles in a few centuries. That level of impact doesn't show up, as far as we can tell, in any earlier layer. If you want to reserve a special number for global, industrial, planet-scale civilization, then yeah, we're probably World 1. So what can we responsibly say right now? We can say there is no clear evidence for a prior global industrial civilization anything like ours. No global mining footprint, no synchronized pollution spikes, no domesticated ghost species from 100,000 years ago. We can say there is growing evidence that prehistory was busier than we thought. Unexpected monuments like Göbekli Tepe, complex societies in the Amazon, submerged landscapes that used to be prime real estate when seas were lower. We can say mythic world counts probably compress multiple different kinds of change, moral, social, environmental, into simplified cycles. They may preserve blurry cultural memories of floods, famines, or sudden collapses, but they're not roadmaps you can lay over a timeline. And we can admit there are big open questions. How many complex coastal societies are still hiding on drowned continental shelves? How early did true long-distance seafaring and trade really begin? Were there regional civilization experiments that rose, fell, and left only a thin dusting of clues? The answers to those questions hinge on a handful of very specific future discoveries. If we start pulling up well-dated stone architecture, harbour works or large-scale earthworks from 30, 40, 60,000 years ago on now submerged coasts, that changes everything. If new dating methods push existing sites much further back in time, if something like Göbekli Tepe turns out to be older than we currently think by tens of thousands of years, that forces a rewrite. If lake cores, cave speleothems, or deep-sea sediments suddenly show a weird, global, short-lived chemical anomaly that looks artificial, that would be a genuine "what the hell is this" moment. Until then, we live in this tension. Hard evidence that says no Atlantean superempire so far, and a lot of suggestive edges that say but don't get too smug about how much you think you know. If you want to dive deeper into that uncertainty space, the grey zone between solid data and the mysteries we're still poking at, I've put together a book that walks through 12 of the strangest, best documented archaeological and historical puzzles we know about. You can grab it on the website, the link is in the description, and there's a discount running this week if you're watching this around release. For now, the safest position is humble. We're probably not the seventh in a neat mystical sequence of finished, planet-wide civilizations. We are almost certainly the latest layer in a long stack of human and pre-human experiments, most of them small by our standards, some of them capable of leaving stories that survive long after their buildings crumble. And we're the first one with the tools to see deeply into that stack, and maybe, just maybe, to avoid ending our own world the way so many myths say the last ones did. So when you hear a phrase like, "we are the seventh civilization," maybe the most useful move isn't to argue about the exact number, it's to treat it like a lens. What happens if you look at our world as one more round in a very old game? One more iteration in a pattern where environments shift, societies scale up, stories get written about how special the current age is, and then the climate flicks a switch, or the trade routes snap, or some black swan event exposes how brittle everything really was. Through that lens, a lot of things sharpen. You stop imagining a single Atlantis, a single golden age, and start thinking in plural. Many Atlantiuses, dozens of regional worlds that rose and fell along rivers, shorelines and mountain corridors. We're only starting to map. You stop treating myth as either literal newspaper or worthless fantasy, and instead ask, what were these people actually trying to remember, or warn us about, or justify? You stop treating science as a smug myth killer, and remember it's a toolkit with blind spots. We only see what we look for. We only date what we dig. We only dig where it's accessible and funded and politically possible. Seen that way, the seventh civilization idea becomes less a claim and more a question you can aim at the evidence. If this really were round 7, what would we expect to find from rounds 1 through 6? How big could those earlier worlds have gotten before they left footprints we'd already see in ice cores and ocean mud? How many experiments could have played out just on continental shelves, now 100 meters underwater, or in rainforests where stone dissolves and wood disappears in a few centuries? And just as important, what would convince you? For some people, nothing short of a 50,000-year-old steel skyscraper is going to move the needle. For others, a single anomalous date on a single site is enough to rewrite everything. So I'm curious where you land. If you had to name your own 6 worlds before ours, what would they be? Mythic ages, climate regimes, big turning points like the invention of language, agriculture, writing, fossil fuels, AI. And what specific kind of evidence would make you say, okay, yeah, I think there really was a prior civilization in a meaningful sense. Let me know in the comments. I actually read them, and I'm especially interested in what part of the world you're listening from, because different regions carry different memories. Drop your country or city when you weigh in. It helps paint a map of how this conversation looks from different worlds today. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person I had in mind when I put together that book I mentioned earlier, the one about the 12 prehistoric secrets and puzzles that sit right on the edge between solid data and weird unsolved stuff. If you want to go deeper into this uncertainty space, check it out on the website. The link's in the description. And if you want more long-form dives into this kind of topic, where we take big, wild ideas and then actually stress test them against the best evidence we've got, go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. However you count the worlds, this is the one we're living in. We inherited its mysteries. We get to decide how seriously we chase the answers.